напомнить членам, что, находясь в помещении, все присутствующие должны постоянно носить маску, за исключением случаев, когда они непосредственно выступают на заседании. Продолжаем общее прение. Ассамблея заслушает выступление премьер-министра и министра финансов Содружества Багамских островов, его превосходительства Филиппа Эдварда Дэвиса. Прошу службу протокола проводить его превосходительство. А где он? Я с большим удовольствием приветствую премьер-министра и министра финансов Содружества Багамских островов, его превосходительство Филиппа Эдварда Дэвиса. Приглашаю его выступить перед Ассамблеей.
Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, Secretary General Antonio Guterres, President of the General Assembly, Shaba Kurusi of Hungary. Next year will mark 50 years since the Bahamas became a fully independent sovereign nation. Our ascension to full membership of the United Nations in 1973 was inspired by a recognition of the interdependence of this family of nations and by the hope that dialogue and partnership can be the path to shared solutions. We Bahamians are justifiably, I believe, proud of what we have accomplished in our 50 years of independence. We are free, democratic, entrepreneurial, and resilient. And our small size has not held us back from great achievements at home and on the world stage. But we are ever more aware that many of our greatest challenges emanate from or are made worse by events and conflicts outside of our borders. Hurricane Dorian in 2019 was a Category 5 storm that nearly destroyed 2 of our main islands. It wiped out 30% of our national economic activity. The impact on our economy, on our infrastructure, and on our people is still very much present. The scientific consensus is that as ocean temperatures rise, we can expect hurricanes of greater intensity to arrive with increased frequency. Small island nations, like mine, did not create the emissions that are warming the earth. But nonetheless, we are on the front line of climate catastrophe. Dorian in 2019 was followed by COVID-19 in 2020. What happens in industrialized countries doesn't stay in industrialized countries. Every year, we welcome millions of visitors to the Bahamas. They are drawn by our country's beauty, culture, and people. But for a long while, visitors could not come. This health crisis quickly became an economic crisis and an education crisis too. Now, as we are working to recover, a global inflation crisis stubbornly endures. It is making the basics of life unaffordable for too many and creating more hardships for our people. The same is true for other countries in the CARICOM region and around the world. And of course, day in and day out, we must also defend our thousands of miles of ocean borders from trafficking in people, drugs, and guns. But we are not waiting for others to act. We are doing what we can to be stronger and to be more prepared. But no one country, large or small, acting alone can stop climate change, nor can we individually reduce the threat of future pandemics or end the policies and conflicts driving global inflation, or tackle global criminal networks. These problems require collective action. It was the second Secretary General of the UN, Dag Hammarskjöld, who was candid about the purpose of this organization. The United Nations was not created in order to bring us to heaven, he said, but in order to save us from hell. The UN was born out of the ashes of 2 world wars. Today, we face different threats, ones that require us to mobilize and innovate, and above all, to collaborate. Of all the risks we face, none requires more urgent action than the climate crisis. The first UN climate conference took place in 1992. Yet, despite decades of conferences and meetings featuring warnings from scientists and experts, 1/6 of all the carbon emissions ever, some 407 billion tons, occurred between 2010 and 2020. I have frequently spoken, as have so many others, about the need for action in terms of climate justice and fairness. Why should small island nations like mine, we who have contributed so little to the climate crisis, experience the biggest burdens and risk of a climate-changing world? The argument might be straightforward, but it has not been effective. For a long time, decision makers in both the public and private sectors believed that climate action must come at the expense of economic growth. But now, many are beginning to understand that climate inaction is the most expensive option of all. Taking action is not just in the interests of those of us who are particularly vulnerable, it is in the interest of every country, and it is this enlightened self-interest that should motivate action. The good news is that there are also positive incentives. Transitioning to clean energy is going to create jobs, increase efficiencies, and improve living standards. Again, don't do it for us. Do it for yourselves. I do not believe in despair. I believe in determination and human ingenuity. We can do this. Countries that disagree on many other issues, including important ones, must cooperate on this issue in their own self-interest. We have roughly 40 days until COP27 in Egypt. Let this year be the year that we turn talk into action. Let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. Let those who pledge write the check. Countries like mine, already trapped by billions in climate debt, need funding to transition to renewable energy infrastructures. We have begun to install solar microgrids across our islands, but scaling up will require a lot of additional funding. We in the Bahamas are playing our part. In February and July of this year, we hosted the One Young World regional and annual conferences for young people to support the next generation in their efforts to engage with climate-related issues. This was the first climate conference for young people in the region. We recognize the importance and value of the participation of young people. The Bahamas supports the 2030 Agenda and our common agenda on youth engagement. Then in August, the Bahamas took the lead in bringing together the member countries of the Caribbean to agree a consensus position for negotiations at COP27. We are actively defining ways to protect and safeguard our shallow seas, mangroves, and seagrasses, all of which act as a major carbon sink for the world. We urgently need to build capacity. Now we are inviting those with potential technological solutions to bring their innovations to the Bahamas. Mr. President, it's time for a new resolve and new cooperation. Last year, I brought to the attention of the General Assembly the threat to the financial services industry in the Bahamas and our region. I said then, financial services is a crucial component of the Bahamian economy. We see an indispensable role for the UN in leveraging its universal jurisdiction for greater oversight of global anti-money laundering, de-risking, and tax cooperation matters. Sadly, little to nothing has changed. We continue to struggle to recover from the economic shocks of hurricanes and the COVID-19 pandemic. We also have the additional battle with inflationary pressures created not by us, by the war in Europe. And now, to top it off, we are yet again the victims of inequitable and unjust measures on the part of major economic actors. All these factors place a stranglehold on our national development and that of other small island developing states. Just yesterday, the OECD issued a statement placing the Bahamas on their blacklist. Mr. President, this action is profoundly unfair. When we look at the countries that are flagged as high risk and blacklisted, several startling commonalities emerge. Why is it that European states that operate frameworks akin to that of blacklisted countries are not being even eligible for the inclusion on these lists? Why are all the countries targeted, all of them, small and vulnerable, and former colonies of European states? We find it astounding that the $2 to $3 trillion, which is estimated to be laundered each year through the developed countries, are never flagged as causes for concern. And yet my country, which is widely recognized as one of the best regulated countries in the world, and other countries like the Bahamas, are singled out for such reputational attacks. The robust regulatory regimes of our central bank, Securities Commission, and Insurance Commission are chastised on minor details of technical process, while much bigger transgressions in the developed world are ignored. The evidence is mounting that the considerations behind these decisions have less to do with compliance and more to do with the darker issues of prejudged discriminatory perceptions. Let me submit, black-governed countries also matter. Mr. President, we support the call for reforms in the global financial system to make it more relevant to the needs of today. But those reforms need ambition. They need to go beyond the incremental, and they need to apply to all. For example, the community of international financial institutions are in a position to forgive the debt incurred by the economic shutdowns during the COVID-19 pandemic, and they should do so. Every year that we don't do the right thing to do becomes more expensive. Mr. President, when my neighbors are in crisis, whether the cause is climate or crime or instability, the Bahamas is impacted by the humanitarian and security needs which arise. We repeat once again our opposition to the decades-long embargo and sanctions on Cuba. COVID-19 has exacerbated the situation for the people of Cuba and made existing hardship and deprivation much worse. The people of Haiti continue to suffer. The political vacuum left after the assassination of the president just over a year ago has led to more violence, with the instability fueling more tragedy and threatening the entire region. Migration is not the only issue which the Bahamas is grappling with. We are also struggling from the proliferation of guns. We do not manufacture guns in our country, and yet they illegally find their way to the Bahamas, and within days can be connected to some criminal activity. In an archipelagic nation made up of some 700 islands and keys, range across 100,000 square miles of water, defending our borders is an expensive challenge. We believe more manageable and effective efforts can be made at the source to ensure that a right to bear arms does not so quickly and easily translate into a right to traffic arms. Mr. President, we in the Bahamas believe there is still real purpose in the mission of this United Nations. We will continue to support multilateral efforts to tackle the shared challenges of our time. We congratulate Secretary General Guterres for his leadership in achieving agreement with Ukraine, Russia, and Turkey to get the flow of trade in the Black Sea moving once again. The stabilization in world food markets has helped millions of people in the developing world. We see the involvement and participation of women and young people as inherent and central to our process. My government considers it vital that women play fully active roles in planning and decision-making, both in national and multilateral affairs. We also support the addition of a United Nations Youth Office. The needs and rights of small island developing states cannot be sustained by making policy advances only in times of global shock. We are grateful that the Alliance of Small Island States seized the moment in 2020 to secure the course of work on the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index. We consider this a critical step forward in ensuring greater equity for countries such as the Bahamas. We are aware that the global community is grossly underprepared in securing protections of the global commons that includes water, biodiversity, and the digital landscape. In moving forward on this agenda, we also recognize that a more robust and better change-making architecture is needed across the United Nations. In this respect, we hope that members will support the candidature of our citizen, Stephen Bureau, for the seat of Director of the Telecommunications Development Bureau of the International Telecommunications Union for the term running from 2023 to 2026. Mr. President, by each of us acting out of our own enlightened self-interest, we acknowledge that we ourselves benefit from doing what is in the best interest of all. In meeting the existential challenge posed by the climate crisis, it should be an increasing self-evident truth that none of us can be safe until we are all safe. Thank you.
От имени Ассамблеи
On
хочу
behalf of the
поблагодарить
Assembly,
премьер-министра
I wish
и
to
министра
thank the
финансов
Prime Minister
Содружества
and
Багамских
Minister for
островов
Finance
за
of the
только что
Commonwealth
сделанное
of the
заявление
Bahamas
и
for the
прошу службу
statement just
протокола
made,
проводить
and I
его
request protocol to
превосходительство.
escort His Excellency.
Ассамблея
The
заслушает
Assembly
выступление
will
временного
hear an
исполняющего
address by
обязанности
His
премьер-министра
Excellency
Республики Мали,
Abdoulaye
его
Maïga,
превосходительство
Prime
Абдуллая
Minister
Маиги.
ad interim
Прошу
of the
службу
Republic of
протокола
Mali. I
проводить
request
его
protocol to escort His
превосходительство.
Excellency.
Я с большим удовольствием
I have
приветствую
great pleasure in
временного
welcoming His
исполняющего
Excellency
обязанности премьер-министра
Abdoulaye
Республики Мали,
Maïga,
его
Prime Minister ad
превосходительство
interim
Абдуллая
of the
Маигу.
Republic of Mali.
Приглашаю
I
его
invite
выступить
him
перед
to address the
Ассамблеей.
Assembly.
Monsieur le Président de l'Assemblée générale,
President of the General Assembly,
Mesdames et Messieurs les chefs d'État et de
ladies and
gouvernement,
gentlemen, heads of state and government,
Monsieur le Secrétaire général de
Secretary
l'Organisation
General
des Nations Unies,
of the United Nations,
Mesdames et Messieurs,
ladies and gentlemen,
de prime abord, je voudrais m'acquitter de
at the
l'agréable
outset,
devoir
it is my
de vous adresser
pleasure
les chaleureuses salutations du peuple malien,
to warmly greet you on behalf
riche
of
de
the
sa
Malian
diversité
people
culturelle,
and all their cultural,
religieuse et
religious and ethnic
ainsi que celle
diversity,
de son Excellence,
and the
le
greetings
colonel Assimi Goïta,
of His Excellency
président de la transition,
Colonel
chef
Assimi
de l'État.
Goïta, Transitional President and Head of
Monsieur
State.
le Président, Votre brillante élection à la
President,
présidence de
your
cette
brilliant election
77e
to
session
the
de l'Assemblée
presidency of the
générale
77th session of the General
et
Assembly
la fin des travaux de la
and the
76e
end of the
session
76th
de l'Assemblée générale,
session of the
brillamment
General
conduit
Assembly,
par
so
votre
ably led
prédécesseur,
by your predecessor,
Son Excellence M.
His
Abdullah Shahid,
Excellency Abdullah
de la
Shahid
République des Maldives,
of the Republic of
m'offre
Maldives,
l'heureuse occasion d'adresser à vos excellences
give me an excellent
de
opportunity
chaleureuses félicitations de tout le Mali.
to express our
Enfin,
warm congratulations to Your
Permettez-moi de
Excellencies
réitérer à
on
notre
behalf of
secrétaire
Mali.
général, M. Antonio
Allow me to
Guterres,
reiterate to our
notre
Secretary
haute
General,
appréciation
Mr.
des efforts
Antonio
louables
Guterres, our great
qui
appreciation of
continue
his
de déployer
laudable
pour la
efforts
réalisation des nobles
deployed
objectifs
to achieve the
de notre
noble
organisation
goals
commune.
of our organization.
Nous sommes convaincus que vous êtes un ami du Mali
We
et du
know
Sahel.
that you are a friend of Mali and of the Sahel.
L'amitié reposant sur la
Friendship is
sincérité
based upon
souffrez
sincerity.
que je vous exprime mon profond
So
désaccord
allow me to
suite à
express
votre
my
récente
deep
sortie
disagreement
médiatique
with your recent
au cours de laquelle vous prenez
media
position
appearances,
et vous
where you
exprimez
adopt
sur l'affaire des
stances
46 mercenaires
and
ivoiriens.
speak out
une
regarding the
affaire
affair of the
bilatérale et
46
judiciaire
Ivorian mercenaries,
deux
which
pays
is a
frères.
bilateral and legal issue
C'est
between two
évident
brotherly
que la
countries.
qualification judiciaire des infractions
Clearly,
liées
the
à cette
judicial
affaire
nature of the
ne
infringements
relève pas des
around this
attributions du
affair
secrétaire général des
do not
Nations
fall
Unies.
under the competences of the Secretary
Au
General of the
Mali,
United
notre
Nations.
administration
In Mali, our
ne travaille pas sur la
administration
base de l'oralité.
is not
ni de
based
déclarations par voie
upon
de
oral
presse.
statements or statements
Par
to the
conséquent,
press.
nous nous en tenons scrupuleusement
We
à la
therefore
note verbale de
refer
la MINUSMA à la mission des
to
Nations
the
Unies
note
pour la
verbal
stabilisation au
of
Mali.
MINUSMA,
Référence MINUSMA,
the United Nations
bar
Mission for the Stabilization of Mali.
PROT, bar
The reference of
NV,
this document is
bar
MINUSMA
bar
/prot/NV
2022, du 22 juillet 2022, dans laquelle il ressort clairement qu'il n'existe pas
which
de
clearly
lien
expresses that there is
entre les
no
46
link
mercenaires et les
between the
Nations Unies.
46 mercenaries and the United
Les
Nations.
récentes synchronisations des actions et l'harmonisation des éléments de langage
The recent
consistant à faire passer
language
le Mali, mon pays,
and
du statut de
synchronization
victime à celui de coupable dans cette affaire des mercenaires sont évidemment sans effet.
which intend
Excellence, Monsieur le
to portray
Secrétaire
Mali as a
Général,
victim,
Votre position sur l'affaire des
guilty
mercenaires
rather
a
than
été
being a victim
suivie
in this affair of
par
mercenaries
certains
are without
responsables
effect.
d'Afrique de l'Ouest.
Secretary General,
Donc,
your
c'est sous votre
position
couvert
on the
que nous
mercenaries
leur adresserons des
has been
messages.
followed up by certain
À
authorities in
l'endroit
West
du président en
Africa.
exercice de la
So
CEDEAO,
we address them this
M.
message.
Oumaro Sissoko Ambalo, qui affirme,
To
je
the
cite,
President of ECOWAS, Mr. Omaru
On vient de
Sissoko,
voir
who
avant-hier
said, we
la
have just
déclaration du
seen, and I
secrétaire général des
quote, the
Nations
statement
Unies
by the Secretary
dit que
General
ce ne sont
saying
pas
that
des
these are
mercenaires.
not mercenaries.
Moi, à la place des Maliens,
If I were in the
j'aurais
Malians'
relâché
place,
ces
I would
49
have released
soldats.
these 49
Fin de
soldiers.
citation. Je voudrais très respectueusement
I
signifier à
should
ce
very
dernier
much like to say
qu'il existe un principe
to
de
the latter that
subsidiarité,
there is a principle
d'ailleurs
of
au contour
subsidiarity,
flou
which
entre
is
la
somewhat
CEDEAO et
vague
les Nations Unies,
between
et
ECOWAS
non un
and the United
principe
Nations,
de mimétisme.
rather than a principle
Également, il est
of
important de
following
lui préciser
blindly.
que le
It is also
secrétaire
important
général
to
des
state that
Nations
the
Unies
Secretary General of the United
pas un chef
Nations
d'État
is not
et le
a head
président
of
en
state,
exercice de la CEDEAO
and the
n'est pas
president,
un
the acting
fonctionnaire.
president of
Par
ECOWAS is
conséquent, il
not
serait indiqué
a
qu'il ne
civil
banalise
servant.
pas la
Therefore,
CEDEAO.
he must
Enfin,
not
il est utile de rappeler au président en exercice de la CEDEAO qu'au Mali, les
make
autorités
the
n'interfèrent pas dans les
CEDEAO too
dossiers judiciaires.
overarching. It's
et
worth
respectent
recalling
l'indépendance
to
de la
the current
justice.
president of ECOWAS
Donc, nous n'avons
that
pas vocation à
he must
interpeller ou
respect the
relâcher.
independence of justice. We
Ceci relève de la
therefore
fonction
cannot,
judiciaire.
therefore we
Aussi,
do not intend to
M. Oumaro Sissoko
give
Ambalo
way
doit
on
être
this. This is a
conscient du
legal
fait
issue.
qu'il est
Mr.
le
Omaru
dépositaire
Sissoko
d'un lourd
Ambalo must be aware of the
héritage
fact that he
et de
is
plusieurs
responsible for a
sacrifices
great,
qui ont fait la renommée de cette organisation.
for being loyal to a
Dynamique
great
ayant
deal of
fait la
heritage and
grandeur de la
sacrifices
CEDEAO
under
ne
this
doit pas être
organization.
brisée.
The dynamics
Par
which
ailleurs,
make the ECOWAS
nous avons
so
pris acte de la menace de sanctions
renowned
proférées
must not
contre
be
le Mali.
broken down. We have
Loin d'être
also
impressionné
noted the
par des
threats
sanctions,
of sanctions
je voudrais
against
signaler
Mali,
au
and
président en
rather than
exercice
being
de la CEDEAO
afraid of
qu'à la
such
fin de
sanctions,
son
I should
mandat,
like to say that to the president
les
of the
peuples ouest
ECOWAS,
africains
that
le
at the end of
jugeront
his
sur les
mandate,
efforts
the West African
qu'il a
people
fournis
will
pour
judge him on
améliorer
the
les
efforts that
conditions
he
de
has
vie
made
des
to improve the
populations
living conditions
et non des shows
of our
médiatiques
people,
servant à
rather
des
than
agendas étrangers.
mediatic circuses
À l'endroit de
for foreign
M. Bazoum,
agendas. To Mr.
il
Bazoum,
remarquera que le
he
gouvernement
will
de la
note that the
transition
transitional government
n'a pour le moment
has not
jamais
yet
réagi à ces
reacted
propos
to
injurieux
his
pour deux raisons
slanderous
cumulatives.
comments for two
La
reasons.
première raison tient au
The
respect de
first is to
l'héritage
do
laissé
with the
par nos
heritage
ancêtres,
of our
qui
ancestors,
consiste à ne pas répondre aux
where we
injures
do
par
not
des injures.
respond to insults by
La
other
seconde relève
insults. The second reason
de l'identité
is
de
to do
M.
with Mr.
Bazoum,
Bazoum's
l'étranger
identity.
qui se réclame du Niger.
He is a
Nous
foreigner
savons
who
que le
claims to be
peuple
from
nigérien, frère
Niger.
du
We
Mali,
know that the Nigerian
se
people,
distingue par des
brotherly
valeurs
country of Mali,
sociétales, culturelles
have
et
social,
religieuses très
cultural
riches.
and religious values
M.
which are
Bazoum n'est pas
extremely
un
rich.
Nigérien, son
Mr. Bazoum is
comportement
not a Nigerian.
nous le conforte
His
totalement dans notre
behavior
constat. Excellence, Monsieur le Secrétaire
reaffirms
général,
us in this belief.
le Mali
Secretary
tirera
General.
toutes les conséquences de droit de
Mali
vos agissements. Devant Dieu
Will
et en leur
remember
âme et
what you have
conscience,
said.
nous demandons à
Before
ceux
God,
qui refutent
our
notre
soul and our
version
conscience, we
d'indiquer s'ils
ask those who
accepteront
are
que les
refuting our
militaires
version to
ayant
ask if they will
dissimulé leurs
accept that
identités
military troops,
en
having
mettant
hidden
sur
their
leurs passeports qu'ils
identities
sont peintres,
by saying on their identities,
maçons,
on their passports that they were
etc.,
painters or
avec
builders,
des armes débarquent dans leur
would arrive
aéroport
with weapons in their airport
sans que le pays de destination
without
n'ait
the
été au
country of
préalable
destination
informé
having been informed
et
in
dans le
advance
dessein funeste de
with the
déstabiliser ce
idea of
pays.
destabilizing the country.
S'ils ne
Would they
l'acceptent
accept
pas
this?
en tant qu'État,
If they would
si
not
cela n'est pas
accept
possible
this
à
as
Lisbonne
a state,
ou ailleurs,
if this is not
le Mali
possible
non
in
plus
Lisbon
ne
or
l'acceptera pas
elsewhere,
en tant qu'État,
Mali will also not
ce ne sera
accept
pas non
this
plus
as a
possible
state.
à Bamako ou dans une autre
And
localité
it will not be possible in
malienne.
Bamako or anywhere else in
Monsieur le
Mali.
Président, une nouvelle ère des
President.
solutions porteuses de changement pour relever des défis
A watershed
interdépendants.
moment, transformative solutions
Thème
to
de cette
interlocking
77e
challenges. That is
session
the
de
theme of
l'Assemblée
this
générale
77th ordinary, the
suscitera
77th
l'espoir de
session
meilleurs
of the
jours
General
pour le
Assembly.
Mali,
And this
à la
allows us to hope for
condition que
better
le
days
bilan
for
sans
Mali, as
complaisance
long as
de l'ancienne ère soit établi
there is a
que les
clear
enseignements
stock-taking of
soient
the
tirés
former era.
et que les
That
recommandations
lessons
objectives
are learnt and that
soient formulées.
objective recommendations
Une fois cet
are
état franchi,
established. Once this has
je ne doute
happened,
pas qu'à travers
I
notre
am
action
sure
collective,
that through our collective
nous
action,
réussirons à pacifier
we
les multiples
will
foyers de tension dans le
bring
monde,
peace
mais aussi
regarding
à
the various
promouvoir un
outbreaks of
développement
tension in the world,
harmonieux
but also promote
et lutter
harmonious
efficacement contre les
development
pandémies, la
and
dégradation de l'environnement et
effectively
le
combat
réchauffement climatique,
pandemics, the deterioration of the
les
environment,
inégalités et les politiques de domination et de
climate
prédation des ressources.
crises, inequalities,
Depuis le mois d'août
policies of
2020,
domination and predation
Mali,
of
mon pays,
resources.
se trouve
Since
dans un
August
processus
2020, Mali
de transition
has been
qui
going through
prendra
a
fin le 26
transitional
mars
process,
2024
which will end on the 26th
par le
of March
transfert de pouvoir aux
2024,
autorités élues.
with the transfer of power to
Si
elected
à cette échéance et
authorities.
conformément aux recommandations des
By
assises
this date and
nationales
in line with
de la
the
refondation,
recommendations of the national
les autorités de la transition
dialogue
se sont engagées
on
dans deux
restructuring, the
programmes
transitional
convenus avec la
authorities have
CEDEAO
committed to two timelines agreed
faire
upon
des
with
réformes politiques
ECOWAS
institutionnelles
to carry out political
avant d'organiser
and
des élections dont
institutional reforms
l'objectif
before
ultime
organizing elections,
est de
whose
refonder
ultimate
l'État
goal
malien
is to
afin qu'il réponde aux
recast the
aspirations
Malian
profondes
state
et
so that it
légitimes de
meets
notre
the
peuple
deep,
à la paix,
legitimate aspirations of
à
our
la
people to
sécurité,
peace,
à la bonne gouvernance, au
security,
développement
good governance,
et à la
development,
stabilité
and
institutionnelle durable au
lasting
Mali.
institutional
Dans
stability in
cette
Mali.
perspective, je suis heureux de souligner que certaines avancées
In this
majeures
regard, I am pleased
déjà
to
été
underline
réalisées,
that some
notamment la
significant
promulgation
progress
de
has
la
already
loi
been made.
électorale
The passing
qui
of the
comprend,
electoral
entre
law,
autres, la création
inter
de
alia.
l'autorité
This
indépendante
includes
de
the
gestion des
creation
élections,
of an independent election management
dont
authority,
l'installation est à un stade avancé,
and
ainsi
its
que la mise en
establishment
place
is
d'une
now
commission composée
making
d'éminentes
great progress
personnalités
with the setting up
de
of
toutes
a
les composantes de la
commission
société
made up
malienne,
of renowned figures from all
chargée de la
components
rédaction
of
de la nouvelle
Malian society in
constitution.
charge of drawing up
Monsieur
a
le
new
Président,
constitution.
sur un autre plan, peu de gens
President, on
savent
another front,
que le Mali
not
est le
many
seul
people
pays
may
au
know
monde
that Mali is
dans
the
lequel
only
se
country in the
superposent
world
et se déroulent simultanément
which is currently
quatre types
facing
d'insécurité. Le
4
terrorisme,
different types of insecurity
les conflits
simultaneously.
communautaires
Terrorism,
manipulés par les terroristes et leurs
communal
consorts
conflicts,
étrangers,
manipulated by
la criminalité
terrorists and
transnationale
their
organisée
foreign state
et
sponsors,
les actions violentes
cross-border
d'individus
organized
isolés.
crime and violent action
Parallèlement à
by
ce processus
isolated
de retour à
individuals.
l'ordre constitutionnel,
Alongside our
le Mali
return
continue
to
de mener une
constitutional
lutte sans
order,
merci contre les
Mali is
acteurs de
continuing
l'insécurité,
to
en
fight
particulier les groupes
tirelessly against this
extrémistes qui sont
insecurity, and
responsables
particularly against
de
extremist
toutes
groups
sortes
who are
d'abus
responsible for all kinds
contre
of
nos
abuse
paisibles populations.
against our peaceful
En
people.
ce qui concerne le Mali,
With regard
je
to
suis
Mali,
heureux
I
et
am
fier de
pleased
vous
and
annoncer que les
proud to
groupes
announce
terroristes
that the terrorist
ont été
groups
sérieusement
have been
affaiblis
seriously
et
weakened.
la peur a même changé de
And
camp.
The
Cependant, ces
fear
groupes criminels
is now on
gardent
the other
encore et
side, on
toujours
their side.
une
However, these
certaine
criminal groups
capacité de nuisance
can
dans
still
leur
cause
tentative
harm to a
désespérée de
certain
porter
extent in
atteinte
their
à notre
desperate
intégrité
attempts
territoriale et de terroriser
to
nos
deal a blow
populations.
to our territorial integrity
Les
and to
vaillantes
terrorize
forces de
our
défense et
people.
de sécurité du
The
Mali restent
courageous
déterminées
Malian defense and
à
security
faire face à
forces
toutes les
are
menaces
determined
d'où qu'elles viennent.
to tackle any
Sous
threats
l'impulsion
wherever
de
they
son
come
Excellence le
from.
colonel Assimi Goïta,
His Excellency Colonel
président de la
Assimi Goïta,
transition, chef de l'État.
transitional president and head of state,
le gouvernement du
and
Mali
the government
continue
of Mali is
d'intensifier
continuing
les
to
efforts
step up
importants
their
pour
significant
recruter,
efforts to recruit,
former, équiper,
train, equip,
renforcer les
and
capacités
bolster the
opérationnelles des forces forces de
operational
défense et de
capacities
sécurité
of the Malian
maliennes.
defense and
Je
security
dois dire ici
forces.
que les actions
I must
offensives
say
menées
here
jusque-là
that the
ont permis à
offensive
nos forces
action
de
carried out
remporter
thus
des victoires décisives
far has allowed our
contre les
forces
forces
to claim
obscurantistes.
decisive victory against
Elles ont également permis à l'État de
obscurantism.
reprendre pied
They
et
have
de
allowed the
réaffirmer son
state
autorité
to get
sur
back
une
on
grande
equal
partie du
footing
territoire
and
national,
reaffirm its authority
ainsi
over
que de
much of our
favoriser le
national
retour de plusieurs
territory,
milliers de
as
nos
well as
compatriotes
allowing for the return of
dans leur
several
localité
thousands of
d'origine.
our people to
Cependant,
their
nous savons
homes.
que la solution
However, we
uniquement
know
militaire
that a
ou sécuritaire a ses
military and
limites.
security solution
C'est la raison
alone
pour
has
laquelle,
its
en appui à
limits,
l'action
which is
militaire,
why, in
le
support of the
gouvernement du
military
Mali
action,
s'est
the
doté
government
d'une
of Mali
stratégie globale et
has a
intégrée,
global integrated
comprenant des
strategy,
mesures politiques,
including political,
sociales, de
social,
développement,
and
y
development
compris la
measures,
fourniture des
which
services
includes the
sociaux de
provision
base
of
à nos
basic social
populations,
services to our people who
durement
are so
affectées par la
sorely
crise multiforme
tested by the
que nous
multifaceted
traversons
crisis that
depuis
we have been
janvier
facing
2012,
since January
avec comme
2012.
objectif la restauration
Their
de
aim
l'autorité
is to
de l'État
restore
sur
the state's
l'ensemble du territoire
authority
national.
throughout our national territory.
Dans cette dynamique, le gouvernement du
Against this
Mali a approuvé le
backdrop, the government
24
of
août
Mali on the
dernier la
24th of
stratégie
August
nationale de
approved our
stabilisation des
national
régions du centre
stabilization strategy
et
for
son
the
plan
central
d'action
regions and an action plan
2022-2024.
for 2022 to
Cette
2024.
stratégie traduit la volonté des
This
autorités de la transition
translates the
d'avoir une approche
desire
holistique
of
de
our
la
transitional
stabilisation
authorities
des
to
régions
take
du
a
centre.
holistic approach to the
Elle vise
stabilization
à
of the
faire du
centre of the
centre une
country.
zone stable et
This aims
prospère
to transform the centre
où les communautés
into a
sont
stable,
réconciliées et
prosperous
vivent en
area
harmonie avec
where
leurs
our
voisins.
communities are reconciled and live
Parallèlement, la mise en
peacefully
œuvre diligente et
with one
intelligente de
another.
l'accord pour la paix et la
We
réconciliation au
are
Mali
intelligently and
processus
diligently
d'Alger
implementing our
demeure une priorité
agreement for peace
stratégique
and
des autorités de la
reconciliation, which
transition.
is a result of the Algiers
tant
Algiers
qu'instrument
process,
pacifique
and
de
this is
résolution durable de
a
crise
strategic priority
que
for the
traverse le
transitional
Mali dans sa
authorities.
partie nord.
As a peaceful
Je dois dire que je suis particulièrement
Crisis
heureux
resolution
des conclusions de la deuxième réunion de niveau
in the north of
décisionnel
Mali,
des
I'm
parties à
particularly
l'accord,
pleased to say
tenue à
that
Bamako du
we
1er au
have
5 août
concluded the
2022.
second meeting at a
Cette
decision-making
importante
level
réunion qui a regroupé les parties
between the
signataires
parties
et
to
la
this
médiation
agreement. This was held in
internationale
Bamako between the
a
1st
permis de
and
lever
5th of
certains
August and
obstacles
allowed a number of
afin de
signatory
relancer le
parties
processus de mise en
and
œuvre de
international
l'accord.
mediation to lift
Poursuivant cette dynamique positive et progressive du processus de paix, la sixième réunion de haut niveau du
peace
comité de suivi de
process
l'accord,
and the implementation
CSA,
of the agreement.
s'est tenue à Bamako il y a à peine quelques semaines.
Following this,
Le 2
we held
septembre
the sixth meeting
2022.
of the Monitoring Committee in Bamako.
Cette session du CSA est un signal fort de la
On the
volonté
2nd
des
of
parties
September, and this was a
s'engager dans une
a
nouvelle
strong
dynamique
signal of the desire by the
en vue
parties
de
to commit to
parachever
a
la mise en
dynamic
œuvre
new
de
process
l'accord.
in order to achieve the
Je
implementation
réaffirme
of the
ici notre
agreement.
attachement à ce
I wish to
processus
reaffirm our attachment to this
dont la réussite
process,
demeure l'une des
whose
conditions sine
success
qua
is
non
one
de
of
la
the sine qua non
stabilité
conditions for
durable du
lasting
Mali.
stability in Mali.
C'est le lieu pour moi de saluer une fois de plus
This is an opportunity
rôle
for me
actif
once
de
again to
l'Algérie,
welcome the active role of
l'accompagnement
Algeria
de l'équipe de médiation
and the support from the
internationale.
international mediation team.
Je n'oublie pas ici la situation des réfugiés
I
maliens
must not
dans les pays voisins.
leave
Et je
aside
salue
the
au passage
situation
pour leur
of
hospitalité
Malian
à
refugees
l'égard des
in
nôtres.
neighbourly countries.
Je n'oublie pas non
I
plus
thank
celle
those
de nos
countries for their
compatriotes déplacés internes.
hospitality.
Je veux les
And I
rassurer que le
remembering the
gouvernement du
internally
Mali
displaced
reste très
compatriots.
attentif à
I
leur
wish to
situation
reassure
précaire,
them that the government of Mali is very
que tous
attentive
nos
to their
efforts
difficult
visent à créer les
situation.
conditions propices
All our
à leur
efforts
retour
aim to
dans
create
la sécurité
conditions
et la
allowing them
dignité
to return with
en vue de leur
security and dignity
participation effective à la vie
so
de la
that they
nation.
can effectively participate in the
Monsieur le
life of the
Président,
nation.
dans sa difficile quête pour la paix,
President,
la stabilité
in this
et le
difficult
développement durable, le peuple malien reste reconnaissant
struggle for peace,
des efforts
stability
et
and
des
lasting
sacrifices
development, the
consentis
Malian
par la
people
MINUSMA
recognize the efforts made by
de sa
MINUSMA
création en juillet 2013 à nos
since its
jours,
creation in July
visant à
2013
aider le Mali à
until today,
restaurer son autorité
so as
sur
to help
l'ensemble
Mali
de
to
son
restore
territoire.
authority throughout its
C'est pourquoi
territory.
je tiens à
This
rendre
is why I
hommage au
wish
nom
to
du
pay
peuple et du
tribute on
gouvernement
behalf of
malien
the people and government of Mali
à la mémoire de
to the
toutes les
memory of
victimes
all
maliennes comme
the
étrangères,
victims, both Malian
civiles
and
comme militaires,
foreign,
tombées sur le champ
civilian and
d'honneur au Mali.
military, who have given
Cela
their lives
dit,
in Mali.
il nous faut reconnaître que près de 10 ans après son établissement,
Having said that,
les objectifs pour
after
lesquels
10
l'aménagement a
years,
été
almost
déployé
10
au Mali
years after its
ne sont
establishment,
pas
the
atteints.
objectives for which MINUSMA
ce,
was
en
deployed
dépit
in
des
Mali have
nombreuses
not been
résolutions
achieved
du Conseil
despite
de
numerous
sécurité.
resolutions by the
C'est
Security
pourquoi le
Council.
gouvernement du Mali réitère
This
sa
is why
demande,
the government of
maintes
Mali
fois
reiterates
exprimée,
its
d'un
demand,
changement de paradigme,
expressed on numerous
d'une
occasions, for a
adaptation de la
paradigm shift,
MINUSMA à l'environnement dans lequel elle est déployée,
an adaptation of
meilleure
MINUSMA to the
articulation
environment in which it is
de
deployed,
cette mission
and a
avec les
better
autorités
interlinking between
maliennes.
this mission and the Malian
Dans cette
authorities.
perspective, il est
In
extrêmement
this regard,
important
it
pour
is
la
very
MINUSMA de
important for
rester une
MINUSMA
force
to
d'appui au
remain
Mali
a support
dans sa quête de
force in Mali
stabilité.
as it seeks
Le
stability.
gouvernement du Mali dénonce
The
les
government of
influences
Mali
extérieures négatives
denounces use negative
et les tentatives
outside influences and
d'instrumentalisation de
attempts to
certaines entités
instrumentalize
légalement
certain
présentes au
legally
Mali
present
pour
entities in
servir
Mali
des agendas
to serve
cachés,
hidden
y
agendas,
compris à travers l'exploitation
including
de
by
la question
exploiting
des
the
droits de
question
l'homme
of human rights in
aux fins
order
de
to
déstabilisation.
destabilize.
Monsieur le Président, Le monde se souviendra qu'après
The
avoir été
world will
abandonné en
remember that
plein vol,
after having been abandoned
le 10 juin
mid-flight on the 10th
2021
of
par
June
la France,
2021 by France, which
unilatéralement
unilaterally
décidé de
decided
retirer
to
la force
withdraw
Barkhane du Mali,
its Barkhane force
mon
from
pays
Mali,
a été
my
ensuite
country
poignardé
was
dans le
then
dos
stabbed
par
in the
les
back
autorités
by the French
françaises.
authorities.
La précision est d'autant plus utile
It is
que nous
extremely
refusons
important to
tout
say that we
amalgame avec
refuse
le
any
peuple
amalgam with
français
the French people,
que nous
whom
respectons.
we respect.
Les autorités françaises, profondément anti-françaises,
The deeply
pour avoir
anti-French
régné les
French
valeurs morales
authorities
universelles,
have denied the
trahi le
universal
lourd
moral
héritage
values,
humaniste des philosophes des
have
Lumières,
repudiated these
se
and
sont
betrayed
transformés en
the
une junte au
humanistic
service de
legacy
l'obscurantisme.
of
Je
their
répète,
philosophers, and they
les
are
autorités
now
françaises,
serving an
profondément
obscurant
anti-françaises,
junta.
pour avoir
So
régné les
deeply
valeurs
anti-French
morales
French
universelles,
forces have
trahi
rejected
le lourd
universal
héritage
moral
humaniste des
values
philosophes des
and
Lumières,
betrayed the
se
great
sont transformés
humanist
en une
and
junte
philosophical
au
heritage.
service de
They have now
l'obscurantisme.
become an
Je répète pour une dernière
obscurantist
fois.
junta. Let me repeat
Les
this once
autorités
again.
françaises,
The
profondément anti-françaises,
French authorities
pour avoir régné les valeurs morales universelles,
have
et
rejected
trahi le lourd
universal
héritage
moral
des philosophes
values
des
and
Lumières,
betrayed the great
se sont
heritage of
transformés en
their
une junte au
philosophers
service de
and have
l'obscurantisme.
become a junta serving obscurantism.
Obscurantisme de la junte française
Obscurant
nostalgique,
French junta
de
who
pratiques
is
néocoloniales,
nostalgic for
condescendantes,
neocolonialist, condescending,
paternaliste et revancharde,
paternalistic
qui a
and
commandité et
vengeful
prémédité des
practices
sanctions inédites,
which
illégales,
has led
illégitimes
which
et
has
inhumaines
carried out
de la
unprecedented
CEDEAO et de
illegal
l'UEMOA
illegitimate
contre le Mali et mon
sanctions
pays.
by the
Après plus de
ECOWAS
10 ans
and
d'insécurité
UA against Mali.
et en fait des
After
milliers
10
de
years
morts,
of insecurity leading to
tant de
thousands of
réfugiés et de
deaths,
déplacés internes,
refugees and internally displaced.
n'est-ce pas un
Is
sacrilège
it not now a
de mettre une population
sacrilege
malienne victime de l'insécurité dans un pays enclavé
for a
sous
Malian
embargo pendant
population
7
who's a
mois,
victim of insecurity
en
and has
procédant à la fermeture des
under
frontières
embargo for 7
et la
months
saisie des
by
comptes financiers du
closing
Mali?
borders and seizing bank
Grâce à
accounts
sa
in Mali.
résilience et à la
Thanks
solidarité
to
des pays
its
amis et des
resilience
peuples
and the
africains,
solidarity of friendly
le peuple
countries and the
malien a
African
tenu
people, the
et a
Malian
déjoué le
people
pronostic de ses adversaires.
is now
Obscurantisme de la junte française
foiling
qui s'est
their
rendu
plans.
coupable
The
d'instrumentalisation
French
des
junta and
différences
its
ethniques,
obscurantism is guilty of
en oubliant si
instrumentalizing
vite
ethnical differences by
responsabilité
forgetting
dans le
its
génocide
responsibility for the
contre les
genocide against the
Tutsis au
Tutsis
Rwanda.
in Rwanda.
coupable également de tenter désespérément
It was also
de
guilty of
diviser les
desperate
Maliens,
attempts to divide
enfants d'une même famille.
Malian children
Enfin,
from the
obscurantisme de
same
la junte
families.
française
Finally,
qui a violé
an
l'espace aérien malien en y
obscurantist
faisant
French
voler des
junta
vecteurs
which has
aériens,
violated
tels que des
Malian
drones,
airspace by
des hélicoptères
sending
militaires et des avions de
aircraft
chasse,
such as
plus
drones,
d'une
military
cinquantaine de fois,
helicopters and
en
fighter
apportant
planes
des
over
renseignements,
50
des armes,
times,
des munitions
bringing
aux groupes
information,
terroristes,
weapons and
afin de se
ammunition to
donner une bonne
terrorist
conscience.
groups.
In
La
order
junte
to
française
ease
accuse
its
le Mali de n'avoir pas
conscience, the
été
French
reconnaissant
junta accuses Mali
en se
of
gargarisant
not
de la
having been
mort
grateful,
regrettable
banging on
de
about the
59 soldats
regrettable
français au
death
Mali
of 59 French
lors de diverses
soldiers in
opérations
Mali
de lutte contre le
during
terrorisme.
various counter-terrorism
À cette triste
operations.
accusation,
Regarding this
nous
unfortunate
rappelons que dans la
accusation, we'd like
majorité
to
des
remind you
interventions
that
d'officiels
in
maliens,
most Malian
cérémonies,
official statements
nous
and in
rendons
ceremonies,
systématiquement
we systematically
un
pay
hommage à
tribute
l'ensemble des victimes
to
de
all
l'insécurité
victims of
au
insecurity
Mali,
in Mali,
sans distinction de
with no
nationalité,
distinction based on nationality,
y compris les
including
50
therefore
59
those
Français
59
décédés.
French people who died.
Aussi,
Thus,
nous les
we
invitons
would
à
urge
ne
them
pas s'arrêter à si bon
not
chemin
to stop
et de
since they're
remonter
going
le
along
temps,
the right lines. They should
en
turn
passant
back the
par leur
clock.
intervention en Libye,
Let's look at their
décriée par
intervention
toute
in
l'Afrique,
Libya that's decried
sans
by
oublier
all
la
of
participation
Africa.
forcée
And
des
let's
milliers
not forget
d'Africains
the forced
à la
participation
Première
of
et la Seconde
thousands
Guerre
of
mondiale,
Africans in the First
sans
and
oublier
Second
la
World
traite
War.
négrière qui
Let's not
explique le sort
forget the
économique de
slave
beaucoup de
trade,
pays.
which explains
Combien d'Africains
the
sont-ils morts
economic
pour la France et le monde libre dans
well-being of
lequel
the country. How
nous
many
vivons?
Africans died for France and
Monsieur
the
le
free
Président,
world
eu égard à la
in which
gravité
we
des
live?
faits commis par la
So,
junte
given
française,
the serious nature
le Mali,
of
dans sa lettre en
the
date du
facts
15
committed
août
by the French
2022,
junta, Mali in
a
its
demandé
letter
la
dated
tenue
the
d'une
15th
réunion
of August
d'urgence du Conseil de
2022,
sécurité des Nations Unies.
requested the holding of
Cette
an
réunion a pour
emergency
objet de
meeting of the
permettre au
UN
Mali
Security Council.
de
The aim
présenter
of
les éléments
this
de preuve en
is
sa possession,
to enable Mali to
démontrant
present
que l'armée
evidence that
française
it
a
has showing
agressé
that the French
en de
army
maintes reprises mon pays,
attacked on numerous
en
occasions
violant de
my
manière
country
répétitive
by
et
violating
fréquente
repeatedly and
l'espace aérien
frequently
malien
Mali's
sans
airspace
autorisation des autorités
without the
maliennes
authorization of the Malian
et parfois
authorities and
en
sometimes
falsifiant des
by
documents de vol.
falsifying flight
Plus
documents.
grave, Monsieur le Président, le Mali sera en
More
mesure de
seriously,
prouver
Mr. President,
que la
Mali
junte
will be
française a
able
fourni
to
des
prove that the
renseignements
French junta
et des
provided
armes à des groupes terroristes.
intelligence and arms to
Le gouvernement
terrorist
du Mali
groups.
s'interroge
Government
sur
of
les raisons
Mali
qui
is
poussent cet
wondering
État membre du
about
Conseil de
the
sécurité
reasons that have
de surcroît
encouraged
assurant
this
la
permanent
présidence de
member
cet
of the
organe
Security Council
à faire obstacle au
and
débat
one that has
en
the
vue de la
presidency of the
manifestation
body
de la vérité.
to prevent obstacles
Le
to
monde
the
doit
debate
être édifié sur les faits graves qui se sont
because of the
déroulés au
truth.
Mali et
The
qui
world
sont à la
needs to
base
be
de
enlightened
l'aggravation
on the serious facts
l'insécurité
that took place
et de
in
la
Mali
déstabilisation du
and
Mali
which
et
are
du
the
Sahel.
basis of the worsening insecurity
Par la
and
saisine du Conseil de
destabilization in
sécurité,
Mali.
le
Through
gouvernement du
seizing the
Mali
Security
entend mettre
Council, the
cet
government of
important
Mali
organe
is seeking to
chargé à
ensure
titre
that this
principal du maintien
important
de la
body
paix
that's in
et
charge
de la
of
sécurité
the
internationale
maintenance of international peace and
face à ses
security to ensure that it faces its
responsabilités, dénoncer les
responsibilities
agissements de la
and
junte française contre
denounces
mon
the
pays.
abuse of the French junta
Ces
against my
actes hostiles
country. These
sont
hostile
incompatibles
acts
avec la
are
Charte des Nations
incompatible
Unies
with the UN
et
Charter
son statut de
and
membre
its
permanent.
statute
Il y va de la
as a
crédibilité
permanent
de notre
member.
mécanisme commun,
The
de
credibility of our
l'efficacité de
joint
la lutte contre
mechanism
le
depends
terrorisme,
on it, as does the
mais surtout,
effectiveness
il y va de
of
l'intégrité
our
de
fight against
l'Organisation des Nations
terrorism.
Unies,
But in particular,
qui
so does the
repose entre autres
integrity
sur le respect des
of the
engagements
UN. That
internationaux,
inter alia is based on the
de
respect
la
of
légalité
international commitments,
internationale et de
international
la Charte des
law
Nations Unies.
of the
Monsieur le
UN
Président,
Charter. Mr.
il semble
President,
opportun
it
pour le
seems
Mali de
important
demander
for
votre
Mali
implication
to
personnelle
call for
auprès
your
du Conseil
personal
de sécurité des
involvement
Nations Unies
with
afin que
the
notre
Security
demande
Council of the
aboutisse
United Nations, so
et que
that
cesse
our
la
request be
duplicité
successful, so
et la
that
guerre
this
par procuration
duplicity and
imposée
the
à mon
proxy
pays.
war imposed upon my
Monsieur le
country
Président,
stops.
dans la lutte contre
Mr.
le terrorisme et
President,
l'extrémisme violent,
in combating terrorism and
le
violent
gouvernement du Mali
extremism,
est
the
fortement
government of
interpellé
Mali
sur la
takes
question
very
des droits de
seriously the
l'homme.
question of human rights.
Je tiens à
I'd
souligner
like to
que les droits de
underscore
l'homme
that
constituent
human
avant tout
rights
des
are
valeurs
first and
qu'incarne
foremost
chaque Malien.
the values that each
Aussi, le
Malian
gouvernement du Mali
embodies.
reste
Thus,
déterminé
the government of Mali remains
à les
determined
respecter
to respect
et à
them
les faire
and to ensure
respecter,
they are respected
conformément à sa
in
politique de
line
tolérance
with its
zéro
zero tolerance
contre
policy
l'impunité.
against impunity.
Et cela par fidélité à nos valeurs
As
ancestrales
it's loyal to its
inscrites dans
ancestral
la charte de
values that are
Kurukanfuga,
enshrined in the
proclamée en
Kurukanfuga Charter
1236
proclaimed in
par l'empereur du Mali, Sundiata
1236
Keita.
by the Emperor of
Le
Mali,
Mali, berceau de grandes civilisations,
Keita.
héritier de
This
grands
is why we
empires,
believe in this.
terre de
Mali
brassage,
is a cradle of great
d'hospitalité et de
civilizations.
tolérance,
There were once
fait
great
de la promotion
empires,
et de la
a
défense des
land
droits
of
de l'homme
exchange,
une
hospitality and
priorité
tolerance.
nationale.
Mali makes promoting and
C'est pourquoi
defending
je
human
réaffirme
rights a
avec
national
force
priority.
que les
This
opérations
is why
militaires
I
des forces de défense et de sécurité du Mali
confirm that the military
conduites dans le
operations of
strict
the
respect
Malian
des droits de
Defense
l'homme
and Security
et
Forces
du droit
are
international
conducted strictly
humanitaire.
respecting human rights and
Cependant,
international
comme je viens de le
humanitarian
souligner,
law. Nonetheless,
le
as I've
gouvernement du Mali
underscored, the government
s'oppose
of
avec
Mali
véhémence
is vehemently
à
opposed to the
l'instrumentalisation de la question des droits
instrumentalization
de
of the
l'homme à des
question
fins
of human
politiques,
rights for political
positionnement,
purposes. Is
voire de
opposed to
chantage ou
posturing,
d'intimidation.
blackmail and
De même,
intimidation.
nous regrettons la
By the same
sélectivité
token, we
observée
regret the
entre les
selectivity
droits des
observed
populations dont des villages
vis-à-vis
entiers sont
populations
massacrés,
in some villages
rasés,
who are totally massacred
suscite
and their villages razed to the
presque
ground,
pas d'indignation
and there doesn't seem to
particulière
be any
de la
indignation
manipulation
regarding them,
communicationnelle
and
faisant
the
passer des
media
terroristes neutralisés sur le
manipulation
champ de
that
bataille
goes on claiming
pour des
that
civils
terrorists who
innocents.
have been neutralized
Monsieur
in
le
the
Président,
battlefield are in fact
pour
innocent
terminer,
civilians.
je dirais que le peuple malien
In
a décidé
conclusion,
de
Mr.
prendre
President, I'd
son
like to
destin
say that the
en main.
Malian people have decided to take their
Soutient
destiny into their
pleinement
own
le gouvernement
hands.
dans la
They
refondation du
fully
Mali,
support the
ainsi
government
que le retour
as
à un
it
ordre
works in
constitutionnel
Mali, and also
apaisé
support the return to
et
constitutional
sécurisé en mars
order that
2024
will be peace and
à l'issue
safe
d'élections libres,
in March
transparentes et
2024
crédibles.
following the
La
free,
réalisation
credible
de
and
ces
transparent
vastes chantiers
elections
exige du
to be
gouvernement de
held.
poursuivre et
Achieving
d'intensifier
these
les efforts en
broad-raising
vue de l'amélioration
priorities
continue de
mean
la
that the
situation
government
sécuritaire dans le
needs to
pays
continue and step up efforts
et de la protection des
to
personnes et de
improve the
leurs biens.
security
À
situation
cet
in the
égard,
country to
je me
protect
réjouis de la
people
tenue à
and
Lomé
their property. To
le
this
6 septembre
end,
dernier
I'm
de la
delighted
troisième
that in
réunion du
Lomé,
groupe de
on the
suivi et
6th
de
of
soutien à la
September this
transition,
year, the
les
third meeting
conclusions
of
de
the
cette
transition,
importante
a
rencontre,
follow-up and support group was
notamment
held.
la
The conclusions
reconnaissance
of
des
this
progrès
important
réalisés
meeting,
par
in
la
particular
transition
the recognition of the progress
et les
made
appels
by the
lancés en
transition,
faveur de la
and the
mobilisation de
calls
tous les
for
partenaires
mobilizing all of
du
Mali's
Mali pour
partners
consolider leur
to
appui
consolidate
politique,
their political,
économique, technique et
economic,
financier à la République du
technical
Mali,
and financial support for the
ainsi
Republic of
que pour
Mali,
soutenir les les
and
efforts des
for the
autorités de la
efforts
transition
of
du
the
Mali
Malian transition
en vue d'un
authorities
retour harmonieux à l'ordre
to
constitutionnel.
ensure a harmonious
Je voudrais
return to
rappeler que la
constitutional order
transition au
were very
Mali
important. I'd like to recall
résulte
that the
de
transition
plusieurs années de
in Mali
dysfonctionnement de
results
notre jeune démocratie
from
qui a
several years
engrangé
of
quelques
dysfunction
résultats
in our young
positifs.
democracy.
Malheureusement,
This
à
did
l'heure du
have
bilan,
some
les
positive
passifs sont plus
results.
importants que les actifs.
unfortunately, as
D'où
we
la
look
survenance
at it,
de la
there have been
transition.
more setbacks than steps
saisis cette
forward.
opportunité
And
qui
that's
m'est
why we
offerte
needed the transition. I'd like to take
pour
this
remercier
opportunity
chaleureusement
to
notre
warmly
respecté
thank
aîné,
our respected
Son
elder,
Excellence le
His
Président
Excellency
Alassane Dramane
President
Ouattara,
Alassane
pour les
Dramane
sages et éclairés
Ouattara,
conseils
for his
qu'il
wise,
nous a
clear
prodigués dans son
counsel
allocution
that
mémorable
he gave us
à cette
in his
77e session
memorable
de l'Assemblée
statement
générale
at
des
the
Nations
77th
Unies.
session of the UN General
Je
Assembly.
voudrais le rassurer que
I would
les
like
autorités de la
to
transition
reassure
malienne
him
n'ont
that the
d'autres
Malian
objectifs
transition authorities
que de
have no other
faire
aim
des réformes
but
politiques et
to
institutionnelles
carry out political and
avant d'organiser
institutional
des élections,
reform before
tout en
organizing
luttant
elections,
obstinément contre le
whilst
terrorisme.
obstinately combating
Ces
terrorism.
réformes permettront
These
d'améliorer la
reforms will
gouvernance
help to improve
et
governance,
toutes les dispositions
and
seront
all
prises pour
measures
que la
will be
démocratie
taken
malienne
to ensure
soit la
that
plus enviée au
Malian
monde.
democracy
Dans
be
ce
the
chantier,
most envied in the world.
nous
In
prêterons
this
une attention
area, we pay
particulière au
particular
troisième
attention
mandat,
to the
qui
third
ne sera pas
mandate,
possible.
which will not
Le
be
troisième
possible.
mandat.
The third mandate.
Le troisième mandat pour un
The third
public
mandate
moins averti
for a
consiste
less
pour un président de la République d'effectuer
knowledgeable
une manœuvre
public
en 4
means
temps
a
en vue de
four-step
conserver le pouvoir pour lui seul
maneuver
et son
for the
clan.
president
Premier temps,
in order to
jusqu'en fin du
conserve
second mandat,
power
donc
for
en
him
principe
and
non
his clan.
rééligible.
Firstly,
Il s'agit pour
at
le
the
président
end
de
of
la
the second
République
mandate,
de déclencher une
in
révision
principle, at a time
constitutionnelle de
when he's
manière
not
non
re-electable,
consensuelle.
the outgoing
Deuxième
president
temps,
has a constitutional
au cours de cette
revision that
révision
is not
constitutionnelle,
consensus-based. As a second
président
step,
de la République
during this
sortant
constitutional
modifiera
revision, the
quelques
president of the
dispositions
republic,
constitutionnelles.
the outgoing president
Troisième
will
temps,
modify some constitutional
une
provisions.
fois la
The
nouvelle
third step,
constitution adoptée,
once the
du fond
constitution
de
is
crise politique
adopted,
naturellement, le président
of course, there's
sortant devient
naturally
candidat
a political
en
crisis. The
violation de la
outgoing
limitation
president
du nombre de
becomes
mandats
candidate,
à
which
2.
violates the limit
Sa
of the
candidature est alors justifiée
two-mandate
par
period.
l'adoption de la nouvelle
So
constitution.
his candidacy
Le
is
prétexte
justified by the
est
adoption of a
tout
new
trouvé.
constitution, and any
La
pretext is
limitation
found.
du nombre de
A
mandats à
limit of
2
the number of
concernait l'ancienne
terms or
constitution.
mandates is
Par
2.
conséquent, il est candidat au
And
regard de la
therefore,
nouvelle
he is a
constitution adoptée.
candidate under
Quatrième
the
temps,
new adopted
Une
constitution.
farce électorale est
The fourth
organisée.
step is an
Forcément,
electoral
il
farce
remporte
is
les élections.
organized. Of course,
Il s'ensuit
he
une
wins
chasse
the
impitoyable aux
elections,
opposants politiques.
and
dont
he
certains sont arrêtés,
chases out political
d'autres
opponents.
s'exilent,
Some are arrested,
et d'autres
others
assassinés.
are exiled, and
Les
others
allégeances sont
assassinated.
obtenues grâce au pouvoir de l'argent,
Allegiances are obtained
clientélisme
through the
et les
power of
intimidations.
money, clientelism, and
Dans un langage plus
intimidation.
simplifié,
To put it
en
more
référence à
simply,
une métaphore
and if I
footballistique,
were to use a football
troisième
mechanism,
mandat
the third
est une
mandate
magie.
or the third term in
C'est
office
l'art de se dribbler
is
soi-même
magic in
tout
a
en
way.
gardant le
It's the
ballon.
art of dribbling whilst keeping the ball to oneself.
Excellence, Monsieur le Président Ouattara,
Excellence,
vos
Your
conseils nous rappellent
Excellency, Mr. President
la triste histoire
Ouattara,
du chameau
your
qui se moque de la bosse du dromadaire.
advice is very
Malgré les efforts
timely.
tangibles de la
Despite
transition malienne,
the tangible
dans la mise en
efforts of
œuvre
the
des
Malian
chronogrammes des
transition
réformes politiques
in
et institutionnelles,
implementing the political
suivi
and
des élections,
institutional reforms and those of
saluées
elections,
par la communauté
commended
internationale,
by the international community,
Madame la ministre des Affaires étrangères de la
Madam
junte
Minister of
française,
Foreign Affairs of the French
à qui le Mali n'a
junta,
pourtant rien demandé,
of whom
a estimé
Mali
qu'il n'y
asked
avait pas eu de
nothing,
progrès,
considered that there was
oubliant
no
que nul ne
progress,
peut aimer le Mali
forgetting
plus que les Maliens
that
eux-mêmes.
no one can love Mali
Sa
more than the
position
Malians
singulière et
themselves.
son
Her
adversité ne nous
particular
surprennent guère.
position and her adversity
Hugo,
does
dans
not
Claude
surprise
II,
us. Victor
a classé le
Hugo
genre
in
humain
Claude
en deux
Go
catégories,
classed human beings in two
en indiquant, je
categories.
cite,
There are, he
il y a
said,
des hommes qui sont fermes,
men which are
hommes
like
qui sont
iron
aimants.
and then men
Fin de
which
citation.
are
Madame le ministre, dont il s'agit malheureusement,
ones who are attracted to them. The
ni fer,
minister,
ni
unfortunately,
aimant, elle est hideusement sui generis.
and
Devant
so
l'incertitude et les
unfortunately, the
situations
minister is
étrangères,
not a magnet
le
and
peuple malien
nor
adopte une
metal.
attitude prudente.
Given
C'est
this
ce que l'écrivain le sage
uncertainty,
Amadou Ampateba
the
met en
Malian
relief en
people
conseillant
adopted a prudent
dans
approach,
l'étrange
and this is
destin
what
de
the
Wangrin
writer
que, je
and
cite,
wise person Amadou
si
Habdeba
observer est une qualité,
highlights with the
savoir se
strange
taire
destiny of
les airs de
Wagrin.
la calamité. Fin de
If
citation.
we see something
Madame
is
le
a
ministre
good
de la junte
quality,
française,
we should
Le Mali
remain
vous conseille
quiet
de vous
about it.
contenter d'observer
So
sa
I
situation.
think, Madam
C'est
Minister
l'occasion pour
of
moi
the
de
French
saluer les
junta,
relations de
Mali
coopération
would
exemplaires
advise
et
you
fructueuses
to
entre
just
le Mali et la
observe the
Russie,
situation.
tout en réaffirmant
This
que le
is
Mali
an
reste
opportunity
ouvert
for me
à
to
tous les
commend
partenaires
the exemplary and
qui souhaitent
fruitful
l'aider à
cooperation
relever les
relations
défis
between Mali and Russia,
multiples
whilst
qu'il
reaffirming
assèle
that Mali remains
dans
open
le
to all
respect
partners
strict
who
de
want
sa
to help
souveraineté,
it recover from
son
the multiple
unité
challenges
et de la
affecting
dignité
it
du peuple
in a
malien.
strict respect for its sovereignty,
Mali rappelle
unity,
que
and the dignity
conformément à
of the
la
Malian
vision du
people.
colonel
Mali
Assimi
would
Goïta,
remind you that, in line
président
with
de
the
la
vision of
transition, chef
Colonel
de l'État,
Assimi Goïta, President of the
trois
transition,
principes guident
three
l'action publique
principles
nationale.
guide our
Premier
national
principe,
public action.
le respect de
Firstly,
la
the
souveraineté
respect
du
for
Mali.
Mali's sovereignty.
Deuxième principe,
Secondly, the respect
le
for
respect des choix stratégiques et
strategic
de partenaires
choices
opérés
and
par le Mali.
partners operated by Mali.
Troisième principe,
Thirdly,
la prise en
taking
compte
into
des intérêts vitaux
consideration
du
the
peuple
vital
malien
interests of the
dans les
Malian
décisions
people
prises.
in the decisions taken.
En application de ces
Pursuant
principes,
to these principles,
le Mali reste disposé
Mali
à poursuivre
seeks to
et à renforcer
continue
ses
and
relations de bon
strengthens
voisinage
its good neighborly
avec l'ensemble
relations
des
with
pays
all the
qui l'entourent.
countries that surround
De même,
it.
le Mali, fidèle
By
à
the
son
same
engagement
token,
panafricain,
committed to its Pan-African
continuera à œuvrer au sein des organisations sous-régionales et
Mali
régionales
will continue to work
pour la
within
réalisation de
sub-regional regional
l'intégration
organizations
africaine.
to achieve
Également,
African
l'atteinte des
integration.
objectifs de la
Equally,
transition
achieving the
requiert
transition's
l'accompagnement de
objectives
l'ensemble des
requires the
partenaires du
assistance
Mali,
of all of
y
Mali's
compris les Nations
partners,
Unies.
including the United
J'en appelle
Nations.
donc aux amis du Mali
Therefore,
à
I would
rester
call upon
mobilisés
Mali's
aux
friends
côtés
to
du
remain
gouvernement
mobilized alongside
en
the
vue de
government
l'aider à relever
in order to
ensemble
help
ces
it
défis importants.
to meet these important challenges
grande
together.
majorité des États
For
du monde,
the significant majority of the
convaincus
states of the
par le
world,
respect mutuel
convinced
le partenariat
rather of
gagnant-gagnant,
the importance
je
of
leur
mutual
garantis que
respect
les
and
portes
a
du
win-win
Mali
partnership.
leur sont
I can
grandement ouvertes
guarantee to
et les
them that
Maliens
Mali's
les
doors
accueilleront
are
les bras ouverts.
wide open to them,
Pour la
and
minorité qui
the
serait
Malians
tentée de ne pas respecter ces
welcome them
principes,
rather with open arms. For the
nous leur
minority
promettons qu'ils feront
who
face
don't want to
à des
respect these
millions
principles, we
Assimi
will
Goïta,
promise
soucieux de
that they
défendre
will
leur honneur,
face millions of Assimi
leur dignité
Goïta
et
who
leurs
want to
intérêts
defend their
vitaux.
honor, their dignity, and
Je
their vital
terminerai en
interests.
donnant deux
I
conseils
would like to conclude
nostalgiques
by
de la
giving
domination.
two pieces of
Ayez le
advice.
sens de l'empathie
You should be
en traitant les
empathetic
autres comme vous
by
voudrez être traités
treat others as
ou en ne faisant
you
pas
would
aux
be
autres ce que
treated.
vous ne voudrez pas.
And do
qu'on
unto
vous fasse.
others as you would
Le second
have
conseil,
done unto you.
revoyez
The
vos
second piece
revoyez
of
vos
advice
modèles,
is look
revoyez vos
at your
logiciels pour
models,
intégrer le
look
changement
at
de mentalité,
how you need to change
l'évolution du monde dans vos
mindsets,
grilles de lecture
and
et
look at
d'analyse.
how the world
Sortez du
changes.
passé colonial
Move
et
on
entendez
from
la
the
colère,
colonial
la
past.
frustration,
Move on
le
from
rejet qui remonte des villes et campagnes
look
africaines
at the anger, the
des
frustration,
populations
the
africaines
rejection
et
of
comprenez que
this
ce
in
mouvement
African
est inexorable.
in towns and rural
Grâce au principe
areas.
de la multiplication
And
fractale,
understand that this
vos
movement is
intimidations et vos actions
inexorable thanks
subversives
to
n'ont fait que grossir le rang des
the
Africains
situation,
soucieux de
your
préserver
intimidation, your
leur
subversive
dignité.
action are just
n'était qu'une centaine
increasing
aux
the number of
indépendances.
Africans who want to preserve
Aujourd'hui,
their
nous sommes des
dignity.
millions. Et demain, tant que les paradigmes
They
inégalitaires
were just
demeureront,
a few hundred
nous serons des
previously, and
milliards.
now there are millions of
le
them.
Mali et son
And
peuple ne
there will
seront
be
pas des
billions of them in the
spectateurs face aux
future.
assauts
Mali and its
et
people
l'adversité.
will not just be mere
Pour chaque mot employé de
spectators.
travers,
Each
nous réagirons par
angry
réciprocité.
word is one that we will
Pour chaque balle tirée
respond
contre nous,
with
nous
equally,
réagirons
and
par réciprocité.
each
C'est à ce prix qu'une nouvelle
bullet
ère sera
fired
une réalité
will be responded
avec des
to
solutions porteuses de
reciprocally.
changement pour relever
So
des défis
we are in a new
interdépendants
era with a new
avec
reality.
des États
We need
interdépendants
solutions
et en
that will bring
valorisant l'homme
change to meet the
sans distinction
interdependent
aucune,
challenges.
notamment
Since
de
we are
race,
interdependent states,
de couleur,
we
de
want
sexe,
to
de langue,
uphold
de
human
religion,
rights without distinction
d'opinion
or
politique,
based on race,
ou de
color,
toute autre
sex, language,
opinion,
religion, political opinion, or
d'origine
any other
nationale ou
opinion,
sociale,
irrespective
de
of what one's
propriété, de
national or social
naissance,
origin is,
ou de toute
what
autre
one owns,
situation telle que
where one was
stipulée
born, or any
à
other
l'article
situation
2
as stipulated in
de la
Article 2
Déclaration
of the
universelle
Universal
des droits de l'homme.
Declaration of Human Rights.
Dieu bénisse
May
le Mali
God
et préserve les
bless
Maliens
Mali and
des
preserve
forces
Malians,
obscurantistes
the
et destructrices du monde.
obscurantistes and
Que Dieu
destructive forces
bénisse
of the world.
l'Afrique et
May God
préserve
bless
les Africains
Africa and preserve
des forces
Africa from the
obscurantistes
obscurant and
et destructrices du monde.
destructive forces of the world.
Que Dieu
May
bénisse le monde et
God bless
préserve
the
l'humanité
world and preserve
entière
the whole of humanity
des forces
from the forces of
obscurantistes
obscurantism
et
and
destructrices
the
du monde.
destructive
Je vous
forces of
remercie
the
de
world.
votre très
Thank
aimable
you very
attention.
much indeed.
От имени Ассамблеи хочу поблагодарить временного исполняющего обязанности премьер-министра Республики Мали за только что сделанное заявление и прошу службу протокола проводить его превосходительство. Ассамблея заслушает выступление премьер-министра и министра национальной безопасности,
Prime Minister and Minister for National Security, Legal Affairs and Information of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, His Excellency Ralph Gonsalves. I request protocol to escort His Excellency.
Я с большим удовольствием приветствую премьер-министра и министра национальной безопасности, законодательства и информации Сент-Винсента и Гренадин, его превосходительство Ральфа Гонсалвеса. Приглашаю его выступить перед Ассамблеей.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, in these dawning years of the third decade of the 21st century, despite the progress and huge potential for the further upliftment of the world's civilizations, the human condition is racked overwhelmingly by global turmoil, convulsions, dislocations, and the gravest uncertainties about the future. The specifics which have produced in their aggregation and multiple interconnections this debilitating malaise and tumult are well known. We identify here and now those of centrality and urgency: irresponsible and dangerous man-made climate change, a dominant economic and trading system awash with antagonistic contradictions, which has delivered unacceptable burdens to the poor and the weak on the one hand, and benefits in abundance to the rich and strong on the other. Unnecessary and unwise conflicts, declared and undeclared wars, which subvert the settled norms and precepts of international law and contribute to economic hardship and immense suffering globally. Avoidable public health emergencies, inclusive of pandemics, and the distorted, uneven responses thereto, and the dangerous vanities, delusional vainglories, and hubris of men and women in power, particularly in the global centers of imperialism and in the locales of those intoxicated with the quest for hegemony. Mr. President, across the world, the faces of ordinary men and women are strained and anxious. Indeed, there is increasingly a sense of despair. At such junctures historically, civilizations have either descended into barbarism of one sort or another, or accepted the necessity to despair, to embrace fresh hope, conjoined with love for humanity and an abiding faith made perfect in works. Surely, this is the time to embrace fresh hope. This existential longing that touches the human spirit and soul goes beyond the mere amelioration of our current travails. It demands correctives or reformations of a structural or fundamental kind and fresh thinking. Without fresh hope, a desecration of our future awaits us. Fresh ideas are a core foundation of fresh hope. Over 130 years ago, the Cuban patriot José Martí advised that weapons of the mind vanquish all others. Through Martí, we learn that a vital idea set ablaze before the world at the right moment can, like the mystic banner of the Last Judgment, stop a fleet of battleships. Our tumultuous times demand fresh ideas and an invigoration of those which have stood the test of time in the march of civilizations into modernity and uplifting governance. Unfortunately, stale and outmoded thinking too often shapes and dominates the global outlook and conduct of the most powerful nations to the detriment of peace, security, and prosperity for all. For example, at least one mighty state affirms wrongly that it possesses an exceptionalism grounded in a manifest destiny to rule the world. Another considers also wrongly that its population size, growing wealth, enlarged military prowess, and a civilization that goes back to near antiquity justifies its quest for global hegemony. And still others, not quite behemoths, conjure up ancient glories and historic empires as the illusory bases to reconstruct the past, oblivious to the fact that any such presumed future of unalloyed grandeur is actually behind them. Amidst all this competitive jostling for power and vainglory, confusion reigns, and the overwhelming majority of the world's population suffers. It is instructive to note that the contemporary circumstances of the global political economy and society have prompted the powerful and some wannabe powerful countries to proclaim the necessity to construct a new world order, each with its own peculiar agenda. But from the global periphery, which encompasses most of humanity, I ask the relevant and haunting questions. What's new? Which world? And who gives the orders? The future of humanity depends on satisfactory answers to these queries. In this maelstrom, the center cannot hold, and things are falling apart. Yet, we must not wring our hands, metaphorically, in learned helplessness. The principles are certainly not innocent of the extant condition, and there are bundles of credible ideas in our multilateral system to fashion possible lasting solutions in pursuit of peace, prosperity, sustainable development, and security for humanity as a whole. So where do we go from here? Central to a credible, equitable path forward for humanity and our civilized life, living, and production is the requisite of quality global leadership. It is a truism that usually men and women make history only to the extent that the circumstances of history and contemporary reality permit them so to make. But it is also true, indeed necessary and desirable, for global leadership to transcend the existing circumstances given and transmitted from the past and to push the boundaries of possibilities for humanity's sake beyond the normally considered outer limits. I am satisfied that the world's peoples are demanding a quality global leadership which not only inspires them, but draws out of them their goodness, elemental yearnings of humanity and nobility of purpose. Oftentimes, to draw out of them this goodness, humanity, and nobility, which the people themselves may not as yet know that they possess. Mr. President, at this very moment of our assemblage here, in civilization's finest hours, we are eyewitnesses and air witnesses to immense conflict, strife, and harrowing suffering in the world at large. It is an indictment on our civilized assembly that horrific wars rumble on unabated in Ukraine, Yemen, Syria, parts of Africa, and elsewhere. At least one of these wars may lead to a nuclear Armageddon. How much longer, too, do we have to stand the balkanization and systematic oppression of the people of Palestine by those who are in arrogant disregard of world opinion and international law? Why are the illegal, unjust economic embargo, undeclared war, and criminal interventions against Cuba permitted to continue without let-up, despite overwhelming, near-unanimous denunciation by this General Assembly? Why do we not resist unequivocally the sordid attempts by imperialism to subvert the duly elected governments of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and the Republic of Nicaragua. How can we stand askance in relative silence and contented inaction in disregard of Taiwan's legitimate right to exist in accord with the wishes and the will of the Taiwanese people? Why do we not encourage peace and security across the Taiwan Straits by, among other things, permitting Taiwan's participation in the specialized agencies of relevance in the United Nations system, such as the World Health Organization and the International Civil Aviation Organization? All these and other 20th century quarrels and contentions have potentially viable solutions, or at the very least, mutually acceptable levels of dissatisfaction, lodged within a framework of peace and security. Quality global leadership in communion with the world's peoples, credible ideas for resolution, and a coherent multilateralism grounded in international law constitute the only viable way forward for humanity. In short, let us give mature diplomacy a chance to succeed. Mr. President, St. Vincent and the Grenadines has had to face immense challenges since March 2020 and continuing. In March 2020, COVID-19, this pandemic arrived upon us like the proverbial thief in the night. Although we did not close our country down, not even in the darkest days of the pandemic, much of the world locked down on us. Life, living, and production were and still are badly affected. In April 2021, my small country suffered 32 volcanic eruptions which caused widespread destruction of property, immense social dislocation, immiseration of our people, and the evacuation of 1/5 of the population into emergency shelters. In early July 2021, Hurricane Elsa struck, resulting in further loss and damage. In late February 2022, open hostilities between Russia and Ukraine erupted, which exacerbated the economic turmoil which was already brewing globally. The knock-on effects of the Russia-Ukraine war has been terrible for faraway St. Vincent and the Grenadines and our Caribbean. Prices of basic commodities such as imported fuel, food, fertilizer, and hand tools have gone through the roof. Still, we are a resilient people. We are not a people of lamentations, and we are recovering and embracing fresh hope. We in St. Vincent and the Grenadines are working hard and smart, but without a fair and just economic order globally, and a special regard for small island exceptionalism, a global architecture of enlightened multilateralism and internationalist solidarity. Without these things, our Herculean national efforts are unlikely to yield the requisite abundant fruit. Trying to go up a fast-moving down escalator is a challenging exercise. Accordingly, I adopt and adapt the poetic words of the iconic Barbadian, Edward Kamau Brathwaite, from his Awakening, quote, "I will rise and stand on my feet. Ever so slowly I will rise and stand on my feet. I am learning, just let me succeed," unquote. Just let St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Caribbean, and other developing countries succeed. Mr. President, St. Vincent and the Grenadines expresses its profound gratitude for the regional, hemispheric, and international solidarity accorded it at its time of real peril, during and immediately after the series of volcanic eruptions last year. Within 24 hours of the first cataclysmic eruption, my dear friend, the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, telephoned me and placed the Secretariat and the UN specialized agencies at my country's disposal. The World Food Programme, UNICEF, UNEP were particularly heroic in their efforts, admirably coordinated by the United Nations Regional Office in the Eastern Caribbean. The World Bank was most helpful. So too were the Caribbean community and its affiliate institutions, the Community of States of Latin America and the Caribbean, and individual nations across the world. The outpouring of regional and international solidarity was impressive and deeply appreciated. Episodic support must, however, metamorphose into structured, ongoing solidarity if small island developing states are to survive and thrive in this increasingly hostile world in which the metaphoric elephants trample with very little regard for the proverbial ants who make up much of humanity and are vital to the well-being of our global civilization's landscape and seascape. The agenda for small island developing states is well known. Some major planks of it are concerted global action on climate change, inclusive of a sufficiency of resources for adaptation and mitigation, availability of optimal financing for development, including the rollout of a multi-dimensional vulnerability index and a compensation mechanism for loss and damage, and a special and meaningful carve-out for SIDS in international trading arrangements, the cessation of the unacceptable weaponizing of the financial system, an appropriate reformation of the United Nations to reflect the interests of SIDS, and efficacious implementation of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, particularly in relation to eliminating hunger, poverty, and inequality. Of especial concern, too, for our Caribbean is the urgent issue of reparations from the European states for their commission of native genocide and the enslavement of Africans that has caused painful legacies of underdevelopment. Time has surely now come for this issue to be addressed urgently. Reparations is a just and juridically grounded demand. It ought not to evoke confrontation from well-meaning peoples, but support. Mr. President, the continuing deteriorating situation in Haiti demands focused attention from the United Nations. The Caribbean Community CARICOM, to which Haiti belongs, is pained at Haiti's circumstances and the relative neglect by the international community of this nation of inestimable value. Together, we must do better with and for Haiti in concert with the Haitian people, based on their own homegrown solutions and led by them. St. Vincent and the Grenadines has been actively engaged on this issue within both CARICOM and the United Nations. Haiti's 11 million people deserve better. Further, a safe and prosperous Haiti means a far more secure and peaceful Caribbean. In the Caribbean, beyond the Haitian issue, our national and regional efforts are stymied by the unfairness and relative unresponsiveness of the global political economy. Oftentimes, too, the unintended consequences of the actions by the centers of imperialism or hegemonic forces induce suffering or hold back our progress. For example, our Caribbean has had its correspondent banking arrangements compromised or withdrawn by the application of rules which our governments have had little or no role in making. Similarly, blacklists, and we heard the Bahamas this morning on that. Similarly, blacklists or sanctions are imposed or threatened by faceless bureaucrats in imperial centers for this or that matter, without any regard for multilateral rulemaking or settled international law. Meanwhile, interference in the internal affairs of our nations persists through external state agencies or private entities of imperialist or hegemonic centers bent on imposing their wills to their advantage. Oftentimes, their relentless misuse and abuse of the modern means of information technology, with falsehoods and misrepresentations galore, have the effect of polluting democratic discourse and undermining democracy itself. The United Nations must address this issue urgently. This United Nations, too, must reform itself to do its work better. In this regard, the reform of the Security Council ought not to be delayed any further. Many sensible ideas for reform are on the table. Let us get on with it and not make perfection the enemy of the good. The many-sided turmoil of today prompts me, Mr. President, to conclude with the probing insights of Guyana's poet laureate Martin Carter in his celebrated poem, Bitter Wood. Here be dragons and bitter cups made of wood, and the hooves of horses where they should not sound. Here is where I am, in a great geometry, between a raft of ants and the green sight of the freedom of a tree, made of that same bitter wood. Mr. President, in our final reflections at this General Assembly, let us never forget that our work here is to improve markedly the lot of all our peoples. To this mighty end, we must construct optimally a partnership between all nations, whatever our differences, to take care of yesterday's heritage, to accommodate and reasonably address today's interests, and to pursue effectively in peace and security tomorrow's hopes. Thank you.
От имени Ассамблеи хочу поблагодарить премьер-министра и министра национальной безопасности, законодательства и информации Сент-Винсента и Гренадин за только что сделанное заявление и прошу службу протокола проводить его превосходительство. Ассамблея заслушает выступление премьер-министра и министра финансов, национальной безопасности, внутренних дел, государственного управления, информации и управления в условиях бедствий Гренады, его превосходительство Дикона Митчелла. Прошу службу протокола проводить его превосходительство.
I request protocol to escort His Excellency.
Я с большим удовольствием приветствую премьер-министра и министра финансов, национальной безопасности и внутренних дел, государственного управления информацией и управления в условиях бедствий Гренады, его превосходительство Дикона Митчелла. Приглашаю его выступить перед Ассамблеей.
His Excellency Kaba Kurosi, President of this 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General, Excellencies, Heads of State and of Government, Heads of Delegation, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. President, please accept my warmest greetings and congratulations on your election to the presidency of this 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly. I commit my delegation's full support and cooperation in the fulfillment of your important duties. I also commend your predecessor, His Excellency Abdullah Shahid of the Maldives, for his able guidance of the last session of the General Assembly. Mr. President, I'm extremely honored to speak at this important global forum for the first time on behalf of the government and people of Grenada. Exactly 3 months ago today, the people of Grenada exercised their democratic right and voted for transformation in free and fair elections and a solid mandate at the polls. The Grenadian people placed their confidence in me to lead our country for the next 5 years. Mr. President, today I bring my transformational agenda to the United Nations General Assembly because although we are an island state, our world does not exist in isolation. Successful and sustainable transformation in Grenada is inevitably tethered to the sustainable forward movement of the global community. Mr. President, this noble institution is nearing its 80-year anniversary, a significant milestone that is worthy of distinct recognition. As my own country also draws near to a noteworthy milestone, that of 50 years as an independent state, it is an appropriate time to renew our commitment to the principles of the United Nations Charter and to international law. It is also a fitting time to review the achievements of the past decades and to proffer solutions to the challenges that have stymied progress. Mr. President, the COVID-19 pandemic brought our world to a standstill without prejudice for the size and the economic might of nations. For a time, this disease was the great equalizer and forced us all to reevaluate our priorities and our approach to working together. Grenada notes with relief news from the World Health Organization that we might be finally entering the end phase of the pandemic. While we welcome the return to some semblance of normal, it is my sincere hope that the lessons learned from the pandemic will remain and we will not return to business as usual. Mr. President, the monumental challenges posed by the pandemic were unprecedented and seemingly insurmountable. Amid this worldwide disaster, however, our global community rallied and demonstrated what is possible when we resolve to work together towards a common goal. The pandemic taught us all the value of international cooperation, the timely exchange of information, and the sharing of resources critical to avoiding and mitigating similar global occurrences. Mr. President, it is imperative that the matter of climate change be escalated to this level of urgency amongst our community of nations. The devastating effects of global warming can already be felt all over the world, with higher temperatures worsening many types of disasters, including storms, heat waves, floods, and droughts. Our planet is undoubtedly in crisis, but as the ancient Chinese proverb reminds us, crisis is opportunity riding a dangerous wind. This window of opportunity is quickly closing, however, and we no longer have the luxury to kick these issues down the road. We are now faced with the reality that tomorrow is today. Mr. President, we have tinkered long enough and must now accept that solutions to the problems we face may not be found in this grand hall or in the highest echelons of global climate discussions, but rather with the people, especially our young people, who stand to lose the most from the inaction of our current leaders. Mr. President, approximately 60% of the world's population is under 35 years old. In my own country, 50% of the current population is between 18 and 35 years of age. Young people are therefore critical to the success of sustainable development policies and must play a central role in the implementation of the targets set by the 2030 Agenda. Mr. President, I call on all young people to take action. It is not yet too late to do what is necessary to safeguard our planet for future generations. But the time for action is now. The reality is, the leaders of today will not be around to feel the consequences of their decisions. It is therefore up to our youth to lead the charge for the future they want to see. To all young people, I challenge you today to choose to be agents of change over victims of climate change. It can start with small actions that cause ripple effects throughout your families and friend circles, your communities, and eventually the wider world. Mr. President, it was not that long ago that I too was a young lawyer seeking to evoke positive change in my community through small actions. I knew that I could no longer sit on the sidelines and wait for the leaders of the day to solve challenges that have plagued Grenadian society for well over a decade. I had to become the change. In October 2021, I made the decision to enter political life, and shortly after was elected political leader of the National Democratic Congress. Only 8 months later, Mr. President, I led the party to victory, winning 9 of the 15 seats. My presence here today is testament that we can change and we can create the change that we would like to see. But it will only materialize if we step forward and accept the call to be the leaders of today. Mr. President, as leaders, the onus is also on us to create spaces where young people feel empowered to propose innovative solutions to the challenges we collectively face. This is a priority of my administration and has been backed by gender-forward, pro-youth policies and purposeful action. The appointment of the Honorable Kireen James as Minister for Climate Resilience, the Environment, and Renewable Energy at 23 years old is a milestone for my country and the Caribbean region, as the Honorable James is the youngest minister in the Caribbean. Mr. President, confronting the climate crisis will require a complete transformation of our mindset and behaviors, but also, and importantly, the transformation of our energy sources, economic models, and land stewardship. This is a unique opportunity to come together, welcome innovative ideas, and tackle the problems we have struggled with for generations. Our goal as responsible global citizens should be to leave the planet as good or better than we found it. This plea is not without urgency. Mr. President, as the leader of a Caribbean small island developing state, I am all too familiar with the devastating effects of climate change and the stark reality that we may not have a country to pass on to future generations in the face of increasingly strengthened hurricanes and sea level rise. The small island states of the Caribbean are already experiencing significant adverse effects due to climate change. With each hurricane season, and we are in the hurricane season currently, that now brings increased and more powerful storms, we watch and we wait with bated breath and a silent prayer in the hope that this year it will not be our turn. In 2004, it was Grenada's turn with Hurricane Ivan. In the matter of a mere 8 hours, we lost 34 souls, and the Category 3 storm destroyed 80% of our housing stock and decimated our economic and fiscal bases with damage surpassing 200% of our gross domestic product. 10 months later, in 2005, it was Grenada's turn again with Hurricane Emily. In recent years, we have watched with horror as our brothers and sisters across the Caribbean experience their turn. Most notably, Hurricane Irma in 2017, which left the island of Barbuda nearly uninhabitable and wrought significant havoc on over 10 other Caribbean island states, including the British Virgin Islands, which lost approximately 85% of its housing stock. Only 2 weeks later, Hurricane Maria threatened cruelly to exacerbate the wounds freshly inflicted by Irma. Mr. President, the global community would remember the destruction visited on Dominica by the said Hurricane Maria, which left 31 people dead, 37 missing, and an estimated $930 million in damages. Mr. President, I can continue in this vein, highlighting the devastating consequences that Caribbean islands suffer due to the warming climate, including the harmful effects on our rich biodiversity and underwater resources. We are truly on the front lines, and we know it all too well, the ease with which one hurricane can wipe out decades of progress. As I stand here this morning, several Caribbean islands are reeling from the wrath of Hurricane Fiona. This is the reality we face, Mr. President, and why it is urgent that we act. Mr. President, given the focus of my address here this morning, it is evident that climate change is inimical to Grenada's transformational agenda. We continue to insist on a clear roadmap at the global level for ambitious climate action to ensure that global average temperatures remain below the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. As we seek to bolster climate resilience in our island home, I reiterate the call for the urgent scaling up of climate finance for adaptation and the removal of challenges that developing nations face to access climate financing. Additionally, my government calls for increased technology development and capacity building, especially for young people. Mr. President, we are encouraged and indeed proud that a son of the soil has been given the responsibility to manage global climate action. The appointment of Simon Steele as Executive Secretary of the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat sends a clear message of the importance of island voices in the fight against climate change. We are optimistic that we will achieve the mandates of the Climate Convention and its protocols, as well as the Agenda for Sustainable Development. Mr. President, the government of Grenada is steadfast in its commitment to creating paths towards sustainability and promoting diversity. Evidence of our resolve can be found in the first ever long-term National Sustainable Development Plan 2020-2035, which is in alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the anchor for the country's development agenda and the priorities for the next 15-year period. In this regard, the government of Grenada was pleased to be one of the 45 countries that presented voluntary national reviews of the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development during the recently held high-level political forum for sustainable development. Mr. President, our country-led review of progress towards the implementation of the 17 SDGs of the 2030 Agenda comes at a critical juncture in our collective efforts aimed at recovering from the extraordinary socio-economic crisis created by COVID-19. Mr. President, for Grenada, the pandemic exposed critical structural weaknesses and resource deficiencies in our healthcare system. Managing the high incidence of non-communicable diseases, therefore, is an urgent priority, and so too is addressing the mental health of our citizenry. In addition, Mr. President, the economic fallout from the worldwide closure of borders and stagnation of tourism, a key economic driver, exacerbated already elevated levels of unemployment and poverty. My government intends to mitigate such dire circumstances in the future by diversifying our economy and developing a robust ICT and digital economy. Trends such as converging technologies and the digitization of production are rapidly transforming work and life, and they must be factored into training and development opportunities for our young people. Mr. President, we understand that to adequately equip our young people for the future, inclusive and equitable quality education is fundamental. To this end, my government has taken the necessary steps to ensure the framework for free universal education up to the community college level, and is committed to providing second chance opportunities to all youth who did not complete a primary, secondary, or tertiary education. Additionally, we intend to actively seek out opportunities for further studies in digital and creative fields to support our emerging creative and digital economies. Mr. President, the answers, once again, will lie with our young people and their invaluable contributions to the future of the labor force. My government will foster an environment where youth have access to and the support needed to thrive. In particular, we intend to provide incentives to young entrepreneurs, upgrade our agricultural production systems, and bolster our export capacity. Grenada will act deliberately to attract the attention and support of the international community and the favor of friendly nations as we seek to improve the standard of living of all citizens through the exploration of new frontiers of economic and social development. Mr. President, as we emerge from the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic and optimistically prepare to transform our economy, we cannot ignore the new crisis in the East due to current geopolitical tensions and conflicts, which has devastating and disruptive consequences for energy and food security. Mr. President, Russia's war with Ukraine has already threatened international peace and stability and induced hardships upon nations unconnected with the conflict. Grenada associates itself with the call of many for Russia to relent its war efforts in Ukraine and for the parties to negotiate a peaceful settlement of the conflict. Mr. President, mindful that peace is a supreme asset and a legitimate aspiration of all peoples. Grenada renews its firm call for the Caribbean to remain a zone of peace. We also advocate for the economic, social, and environmental development of all Caribbean states. In this regard, Grenada is satisfied that the removal of the US-imposed economic, commercial, and financial blockade against Cuba will facilitate economic and social change there. Additionally, we call for Cuba to be removed from the US State Department's list of countries that are co-sponsors of terrorism. Mr. President, in the same way, we lament that more has not been done for our brothers and sisters in Haiti, a country classified as one of the poorest amongst us. The Caribbean Community, CARICOM, continues to pursue various initiatives to assist Haiti. However, we believe that more productive engagements must be undertaken with all stakeholders to help achieve political stability, peace, and economic progress in Haiti. Mr. President, Grenada also reiterates its support for the ongoing judicial process at the International Court of Justice aimed at bringing a definitive end to the long-standing Guyana-Venezuela border dispute, and we reaffirm our unwavering support for the territorial integrity of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. Mr. President, we further remain resolute in our call for an end to the imposition of unilateral coercive measures against the Republic of Venezuela, contrary to the rules and principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Mr. President, the net effect of the recent and ongoing crises continues to seriously dislodge the world economy and, in turn, the ability of countries to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The adverse impacts on production, employment, and poverty are growing, while at the same time jeopardizing fiscal management in many countries. The government of Grenada is firm in its determination to achieve the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We call, however, for the increased inclusion of youth voices as we seek to chart the future of our planet. We further note that if small island states are to eliminate poverty and attain sustainable levels of development, the vulnerability criteria now applicable to all countries must be comprehensively reviewed as a matter of urgency. The consequence of upper middle income status afforded Grenada and many other small states, without consideration to our specific vulnerabilities, continues to hinder our ability to access concessionary and grant financing. We continue to call for a new multi-vulnerable index, which would eliminate the threat to our economic development and security. And we encourage the submission of additional proposals that seek to address similar challenges that prevent our countries from moving forward on equal footing. Mr. President, the United Nations system over the last 77 years has contributed immensely to humanity. It is now time to consider strategic transformation if we are to achieve the goals set out in the 2030 Agenda and safeguard our planet for future generations. Thank you.
От имени Ассамблеи
On
Хочу
behalf of the
поблагодарить
Assembly, I wish to thank
премьер-министра и
the Prime
министра
Minister
финансов,
and Minister for
национальной
Finance
безопасности,
and
внутренних
Minister for
дел,
National
государственного
Security,
управления,
Home
информации и
Affairs, Public
управления в
Administration,
условиях бедствий
Information and
Гренады
Disaster
за только
Management
что
of
сделанное
Grenada
заявление и
for the
прошу службу
statement just
протокола
made.
проводить его
And I
превосходительство.
request Grenada to, for the
Ассамблея
statement just made, and I
заслушает
request
выступление
Protocol to escort His
премьер-министра
Excellency.
Республики
The
Северная
Assembly will hear an
Македония,
address by His
его
Excellency
превосходительство Димитара Ковачевского. Прошу службу
Prime
протокола
Minister of the
проводить
Republic
его
of North
превосходительство.
Macedonia. I request protocol to escort His Excellency.
Я с большим удовольствием приветствую премьер-министра Республики Северная Македония, его превосходительство Димитара Ковачевского. Приглашаю его выступить перед Ассамблеей.
Председавач на Генералното собрание на Обединетите нации, почитуван генерален секретар на Обединетите нации, почитувани шефови на държави и колеги шефови на влади, почитувани присутни. Силата е во заедништвото. Оваа лекција дека здружено можеме повеќе отколку сами. Денес светот ја учи во неочекуваните околности со кои што сме соочени во 21 век. Прво пандемијата, а сега и суровата војна во Украина. Неопходно е заедништво на демократскиот свет, сега и понатаму, во надминувањето на последиците од светски размери, со кои што се соочуваат државите во Европа и пошироко во светот. Република Северна Македонија, во здружените напори за одговор на почетокот на војната во Украина, се постави веднаш и 100% на линија на надворешната политика на Европската унија и демократскиот свет. И тоа го створивме како држава која што е определена кон мир, кон решенија базирани на диалог, кон европските вредности. Но и како земја која што од собственото искуство научи дека мирот, силата и напредокот доаѓаат со заедништвото. И кога воспоставивме независност по мирен пат во 1991 година, и кога се издигнавме над внатрешниот меѓуетнички конфликт во 2001 година и денес, кога преку воспоставениот концепт на едно општество за сите, сме пример за функционална мултиетничка демократија, значаен фактор на стабилноста на Западен Балкан, а со тоа и на Европа, и доверлив партнер на меѓународната демократска заедница. Функционалните решенија на еден мал простор секогаш се патокас за решенијата на еден глобален простор. Предизвиците, колку и да ги има на едно широко географско тло, кулминираат на едно место, а потоа стануваат потенцијална глобална заграда. Денес тоа место е една независна и суверена држава, Украина, чишто народ се соочува со неприфатлива и недозволива агресија од Руската Федерација. Два момента се исклучително загрижувачки и го бараат целото наше внимание. Едниот е фактот дека агресијата доаѓа од постојана членка на Советот за безбедност на Обединетите нации, како што е Руската Федерација. Тоа што незнасилство одлучува да решава предизвик. Држава членка на организација која што во својата основа го има одржувањето на мирот во светот е спротивно на сите заложби на цивилизираниот свет, да се застане на патот на сите форми на действување, чии што последици се човечки животи и загрозување на светскиот мир. Исто така, покажувањето сила на една географски поголема држава врз една географски помала држава, определена да споделува демократски вредности, е опасен и недозволив преседан. Во заедничкиот свет, составен од географски поголеми и помали држави, ова едноставно мора да се спречи да стане пракса. Проблемите, како што можеме да видиме, се повеќе димензионални и заеднички. Тоа се предизвиците пред кои што сме соочени сите. Во најтешката зима пред нас, во Втората светска војна, да обезбедиме достапност до храна и енергија за нашите граѓани. И решенијата мора да бидат заеднички. Одговорот за испредпредените предизвици е во суштината на темата на оваа дебата. решения на солидарност, одржливост и наука. Кога велиме одржливост, треба да се има предвид уште едно горко искуство од војната во Украина. Битката за мир трае и мирот бара постојана посветеност кон меѓусебното разбирање, будност и брзи реакции. Почитувани колеги, делегати и присутни. Сакам јасно да ја пренесам пораката на мојата земја. Непредизвиканата агресија на Руската федерација врз Украина представува флагрантно кршење на повелбата на Обединетите нации, како и на нормите и принципите на меѓународното право. Таа не може да се оправда, ниту да се релативизира. Руската федерација мора веднаш да ја прекине агресијата и да ги повлече своите трупи од Украина. Историјата ни потврдува дека ниту еден проблем не може да се реши по насилен пат. Прекинувањето на агресијата е неопходност, предуслов да се отвори единствениот можен пат до решението. Тоа е патот на дипломацијата и диалогот, кој што може и мора да биде единствениот механизам за разрешување на споровите и предизвиците меѓу државите. Неизвестноста околу снабдувањето со храна и со енергија ќе ги продлабочи разликите на глобално ниво помеѓу богатиот север и сиромашниот југ и ќе доведе милиони луѓе на работна основна екзистенција, дури и во опасност од глад. Ефектите ќе ги почувствуваме сите, и економски повеќе развиените и помалку развиените држави. Мора да се извлечат искуства од пандемијата, дека меѓународната солидарност не е добро да се води од тоа дали е потребна меѓу развиени или помалку развиени држави. Ако сакаме да спречиме отворање нов предизвик од растешко граѓанско незадоволство од глобален план. Пандемијата потсети дека сите сме еднакви пред заеднички во случајот невидлив убијател, кој однесе милиони животи ширум светот. И упати колку се значени солидарноста и единството, преточени во конкретната меѓународна соработа. Овие принципи треба да ја раководат нашата акција и воиднина во соочувањето со актуелните и суидните предизвици. Конкретно денес, во наминувањето на последиците на војната во Украина, неопходно е да се удвојат напорите за зајакната меѓународна солидарност и меѓусебно помагање на рамноправна основа. Во Европа, каде импактот од војната во Украина е најголем и пошироко во светот. Ова посебно се однесува на изнајдењето можни решенија за наминување на предизвиците околу снабдувањето со електрична енергија, но и со храна. Во овој контекст ја нагласувам значајната активна улога на генералниот секретар Антонио Гутереш, како и на Турција во посредувањето за извозот на жито од Украина. Почитувани присутни, случувањата вој околу Украина во втор план ги ставија бројните други конфликти во светот, но фокусот кон нив мора да се држи изостро. Тероризмот во сите своји форми останува глобална закана на целото човештво. Бројните хибридни закани предизвикуваат загриженост и неспокој. Лажните вести и можноста што ја даваат социјалните мрежи, преку интернет комуникацијата за нивно масовно ширење, е предизвик за целиот демократски свет. Авторитарните тенденции од превезот на лажниот патриотизам се сериозна закана за човековите права и потенцијална нестабилност. Останува актуелно и прашањето околу климатските промени и покрај сите настојувања за заеднички и обединет фронт во спасувањето на планетата Земја. Неодамнешните катастрофални поплави во Пакистан се само последна видлива последица во низата екстремни природни непогоди ширум светот, настанати како резултат на климатските промени. Гумењето на биодиверзитетот, загадувањето на воздухот и недостатокот на вода се наметнуваат како приоритетни закани, не само за животната средина и екосистемите, туку и за животот на луѓето. Така ќе биде се додека не профункционира свеста и секој поединец, дека природата не е наша, туку е дел од нас, и кон неа така треба да се однесуваме. И за сето ова се потребни заеднички акции со засилени, консолидирани напори, во кои што тежиштето ќе се стави подеднакво на превенцијата како и кон решенијата. Конфликтите, нестабилноста, насилството, климатските промени, доведувањето до ширење тешка сиромаштија за милиони луѓе, кои предизвикуваат раселување на населението, што добива и размери на екзодус. Емигрантските бранови од претходните години од Сирија и Афганистан не стигнуваат. Сега се соочуваме и со милиони бегалци од Украина. Република Северна Македонија ја отвори вратите за граѓаните од Украина, кои приморани да ја напуштат родната земја побараа за солниште во нашата држава. Оваа прилика е момент да се одаде должно признание на државите во светот кои што примија најголем број бегалци, како и на големиот број граѓани ширум светот кои се секојдневно се ангажирани во згрижувањето на бегалците и воопшто во помагањето на оние кои имаат потреба од тоа. Мојата земја Северна Македонија во рамки на постоечките капацитети останува посветена кон исполнувањето на меѓународните обврски на хуманитарен план. За успешно соочување со проблемите на имиграцијата од различен вид, неопходно е заеднување на свеста, дека се работи за глобален предизвик, кој бара координирана активност согласно принципите на споделена одговорност. Почитувани колеги, искуствата не учат дека нема мал проблем. Секој мал проблем е потенцијал за голем проблем. Но нашето присуство овие денови во седиштето на Обединетите нации е добар потсетник дека силата и решението се во обединувањето околу вредности. Мултилатерализмот и почитувањето на воспоставените правила и обврски, станувајќи од повелбата на Обединетите нации, се единствен начин да ја обезбедиме толку неопходната предвидливост во меѓународните односи. Иднината ја градиме сега и ја градиме заедно. Наспроти сите несовршености на меѓународните механизми, мултилатерализмот и Обединетите нации, како негова највидлива форма, со универзалната мисија мир, се уште се клучниот катализатор во насочувањето на заедничките напори за подобар, побезбеден и поправеден свет. Глобалните привизници бараат глобален одговор. Ниту една држава не може сама да се справи со проблемите на 21. век. Сега повеќе од кога било е време да покажеме дека мултилатерализмот функционира во време на криза. Во тој контекст, извештајот насловен "Нашата заедничка агенда" на генералниот секретар Гутереш треба да биде водич во глобалните реформи за управување, за да може мултилатералниот централен систем на Обединетите нации да се адаптира на иднината и да придонесе кон заедничките заложби. Агендата за одржлив развој 2030 секако останува појдена точка во таа глобална акција. Таа не само што ги адресира хроничните проблеми на сиромаштијата и неравномерниот развој, туку може да послужи и како платформа за решение за сите останати проблеми, почнувајќи од неопходноста за обединување врз основа на агендата за мир, поставање на човечката димензија во центарот на технолошкиот развој во дигиталната ера. Република Северна Македонија активно работи на остварување на милениумските развојни цели и дава поддршка на сите напори за појаки и поефикасни Обединети нации. Во остварувањето на милениумските развојни цели, заедно со останатите развојни активности на национален, регионален и глобален план, треба да тргнеме од претпоставката дека сме должни на младите генерации да им обезбедиме услови за напред. Младите, нивниот пристап до модерно образование, ориентирано кон иднината и решавањето на проблемите што тие ги адресираат, мора да бидат во центарот на нашето внимание и политички ангажман во годините кои што доаѓаат. Во оваа насока би сакал да истакнам дека втора година поред во работата на Генералното собрание учествува и владински делегат од Република Северна Македонија. Драги пријатели, Република Северна Македонија од 1 јануари 2023 година ја има честа да го преземе претседавањето со Организацијата за безбедност и соработка во Европа, најголемата регионална безбедносна организација. Ова е голема обврска, посебно што доаѓа во време кога во Европа се спушува воена агресија, со сите пропратни последици за мирот и безбедноста воопшто, и просторот е поширок, но јас сум уверен дека успешно ќе одговориме на дадената доверба. Северна Македонија некогаш и самата користник на посредничко безбедносни механизми, вклучително и на мировната мисија на Обединетите нации, преку собствен пример ја научи полезноста од мировниот ангажман на меѓународната заедница. Со тоа искуство, подготвени сме да придонесеме во заеднувањето и развојот на безбедноста во широк контекст. Како председаваш со ОПСЕ во 2023 година, ќе бидеме целосно посветени на благородната мисија во служба на мирот и безбедност, како предуслов и за економско-социјални независимиот развој и верувам дека ќе придонесеме и во унапредувањето на мултилатералните безбедносни механизми. Таа верба е базирана на нашите пракси од заедништвото и придобивките на домашен, регионален и меѓународен план. Представувам пред вас денеска држава во која што сите етнички заедници имаат еднакви, уставно загарантирани права и обврски. Република Северна Македонија ја градиме во граѓанско демократско општество во кое што разликите се предност, а не пречка. И обединети како мултиетничка функционална демократија. Денес не успешен пример на Европа во малом на Балканот. Оцрнувајќи од значењето на меѓусебното разбирање, почитување и поддршка што ги мотивира заедништвото, заедно со два наши соседи, Албанија и Србија, ја основавме иницијативата Отворен Балкан, што е денес успешен пример на регионално поврзување. Тоа придонесува во заедничките заложби за укинување на непотребните бариери во движењето на луѓето, трговијата, пренесувањето стоки и давањето услуги. Но во актуелен контекст ни овозможи да осигураме достапност на храна за нашите граѓани. Со тоа што договоривме да си помогнеме, доколку се соочиме со недостиг на својот домашен пазар, како последица од глобалната криза, и дека нема да имаме забрани за тргување на основните земјоделско-прехранбени производи помеѓу нас. А активно разгледуваме и опции за меѓугранична трговија со електрична енергија и помош со енергенци во напорите за надминување на енергетските состојби со кои што е соочен целиот свет. Ги градиме и добрососедските односи со чувство на одговорност и низ диалог, уверени дека чувањето на националните и државните интереси не е спротивно на пошироките интегративни процеси и напредената соработка со нашето окружување. Напротив, себе потврдувањето најадекватно доаѓа до израз во поширока заедница на споделени вредности. Водејќи се од овие политики на мостови, преку функционална дипломатија, диалог и разбирање, постигнавме остварување на стратешката цел, полноправно членство во НАТО и денес сме достоинствена членка на Алијансата. И по 17 години од добиениот кандидатски статус ги почнавме преговорите со Европската Унија. Од исклучителна важност за мојата земја е забрзаната интеграција во Европската Унија. И ние сериозно работиме на сите потребни чекори кон реализацијата и на оваа втора државна стратешка цел. Граѓаните на Северна Македонија заслужуваат најголем кредит, бидејќи предолго го чекаа овој момент. И јас разбирам зошто можеби се чувствуваат фрустрирано и уморно одејќи по тој долг пат кон Европа. Но ние немаме друга алтернатива, која ќе ни овозможи подобар животен стандард. А и никој не рече дека сето ова ќе биде лесно. Напротив, и покрај сите потешкоти, Европската Унија е се уште најдобрата опција за нашата иднина, за иднината на нашите деца. Ние едноставно ја немаме ниту можноста, ниту привилегијата да се окажеме сега. Дотолку повеќе, сега е вистинското време да продолжиме со полна пара, уште побрзо напред. Сакам да потенцирам дека членството на Република Северна Македонија во Европската Унија е од суштинско значење и за самата Европска Унија, посебно во новите околности на глобален план, кога ово е знак на охрабрување дека процесот на проширување е актуелен, го очекува целиот регион, кој што колку и да има прогресивни раководства, не е имун на глобалните предизвици. А и во услови кога треба и мора да се осигура евроинтеграцијскиот демократски пат на државите од Западен Балкан како придонес во Европскиот мир. Приказната на мојата родна земја, Република Северна Македонија, која што пред 2 недели одбележа 31 година од независноста, е приказна за мир, соработка и разбирање, преку кој што е создадена низ предизвиците на разминување на заканите по внатрешната стабилност и на патот на интеграциите на меѓународен план. Со ова сакам да поточнам дека работиме низ фокус на решенија и низ заедништво во предизвиците кои што не познаваат државни граници, етнички, јазични, религиски или други разлики. Драги пријатели, колеги и присутни, ми причинува особена чест и задоволство, што како председател на владата на Република Северна Македонија имав можност да се обратам на говорницата на Обединетите нации, организацијата чувар на мирот, солидарноста и просперитетот. under the United Nations, the
Изразувам благодарност на господинот
organization that is
Абдула
the
Шахид,
guardian
председаваш на
of peace,
76-то
solidarity, and
Генерално
prosperity.
собрание
I would like
за
to offer
неговата
my
досегашна
appreciation to
успешна работа.
Mr. Abdullah
Уверен
Shahid,
сум дека
President of the
господинот Чаба
76th
Короши, кој го
General
презеде
Assembly, for
председавањето
his
со
successful work.
77-то
I'm
Генерално
confident
собрание
Mr.
ќе
Tsaba
продолжи
Koroshi,
во таа
who took
насока.
over the presidency of the
Пандемијата и
77th
војната
General
во Украина
Assembly will be equally
потсетија на
successful.
слабостите на
The
човештвото.
pandemic and the war in
Дури и
Ukraine
во еден
have brought to
современ
light
21
human
век.
weaknesses
Но како
or
што пандемијата
fragility
ја
even in
покажа
this modern
и моќта
21st
на
century.
човечката
Yet,
издржливост
as the
и
pandemic has
жилавост
also
и
demonstrated
силата на
the power
инвентивноста и способноста на науката за кратко време да
of
се дојде до
innovation and the
потребните
capability
вакцини,
of science to quickly
човештвото
produce the
мора да
necessary
продолжи да се
vaccines,
подпира на науката
humanity must
и
also
да продолжи
continue
да
relying
верува
on
во
science and
своите
keep believing in
хуманистички
its
основи и
humanistic
капацитети
foundations
за
and
мир.
capabilities and
Сите
peace.
сме на истиот
We
брод
are all in the
и
same
немаме
boat,
друг избор,
and we have no
освен
other
солидарно
choice except to
да се
treat each
поставиме
other
едни
with
кон други
solidarity
и
and
обединато
work in
да
unity,
действуваме во
defending
одбраната и
and
на
advancing
прилувањето на основните
fundamental
вредности,
values of
слободата
freedom and
и
peace throughout
мирот
the
во
world.
светот. Мирот
Peace is
се
reached
постигнува
by
преку
making
компромиси,
compromises,
но се
but peace
чува
is preserved
со
with
меѓусебно
mutual
разбирање.
understanding.
Благодарам на вниманието.
Thank you
Да живее
for your
Република Северна
attention.
Македонија, да живеат граѓаните на Република Северна Македонија.
Long live the Republic of North Macedonia.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the Prime Minister of the Republic of North Macedonia for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. The Assembly will now hear an address by His Excellency Muketsi Majoro, Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Lesotho. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. I have a great pleasure in welcoming His Excellency Muketsi Majoro, Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Lesotho. I invite him to address the Assembly.
Your Excellency, Mr. Saba Korosi, President of the 77th session of the General Assembly, Your Excellencies, Heads of State and of Government, Your Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, at the very outset, allow me to congratulate you on your well-deserved election to the office of the President of the General Assembly for the 77th session. Mr. President, your illustrious career as a diplomat assures us of a successful session. I assure you of my delegation's full support and cooperation during your tenure of office. I also wish to commend your predecessor, His Excellency Mr. Abdullah Shahid, for his stewardship in discharging his duties during the previous session. To Secretary General Guterres, I extend my country's gratitude and support for the tireless efforts in the daunting task of finding lasting solutions to the persistent problems that face our organization. We particularly commend you for the wide-ranging reform efforts to equip the organization to provide more effective support for member states across the spectrum of the challenges they face, including stronger partnerships for the 2030 agenda. We welcome our Common Agenda report, which focuses on the next 25 years and represents your vision on the future of global cooperation through reinvigorated multilateralism within the United Nations at the center, with the United Nations at the center of our efforts. Mr. President, Excellencies, from the humble beginnings of a fledgling organization more than 7 decades ago to a massive expansion in membership today, the United Nations has undoubtedly stood the test of time. Our organization has witnessed several changes in the configuration of international relations. Some were traumatic, while others were benign. The survival of the UN through all those tribulations testifies to its resilience and the enduring validity of its mission. Some of the great strides that the United Nations has made span peaceful settlement of disputes, restoring calm in many countries through peacekeeping, decolonization, raising awareness of human rights, and eradicating diseases. Despite these laudable achievements, numerous challenges still remain in the path towards assuring humanity of a bright, prosperous, dignified, and secure future. The continuous eruption of armed conflicts throughout the world, terrorism, climate change, diseases, and the lingering effects of economic and financial crisis, and many others continue to transcend our borders and have remained in the foreground of international relations and preoccupied the international community. It is in this context that we welcome the theme for our general debate today, a watershed moment, transformative solutions to interlocking challenges. Mr. President, we are living in uncertain times. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed the nature of multilateral engagement, diplomacy, business, and of basic human interaction. The pandemic has not only hastened the pace and scale of digital revolution, but has also increased the gap between the haves and the have-nots, and furthermore exposed our vulnerability as Africa's landlocked, least developed country. We therefore need to make concerted efforts to protect lives and empower the citizenry across the globe through innovation and digital technologies to achieve sustainable recovery. It is of paramount importance for us as African leaders to be proactive in investing in research and development in readiness for a certain future pandemic. At the same time, the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals, which was already anemic prior to 2020, has been aggravated by the pandemic. The expectation of the international community was to intensify the decade of action to achieve the goals. But certainly, we find ourselves in a prolonged period of recovery. As we ushered in the new 17 Sustainable Development Goals on 1st January 2016, member states were optimistic that the better life for all was in sight. However, the 2030 deadline for the achievement of the SDGs is gradually approaching, yet there is still no significant progress in their attainment due to several factors that have adversely affected implementation. In addition to the pandemic, this includes unpredictable global shocks, including wars, climate-related events, and lack of predictable financing. The environment in which we operate is significantly less favorable than it was when we began 6 years ago. Our room to maneuver is much more constrained today. Nevertheless, our quest to pursue a sustainable future must never wane. Unless we can work towards the SDGs in a true spirit of partnership, where each partner lives up to expectations, the decade of action will end as a decade of disappointment. As Secretary General stated during the election of the President of the General Assembly in June this year, the 77th session can be a moment of transformation, a time to recalibrate multilateralism and strengthen the foundations of global cooperation. In this regard, I appeal to all member states to use the 77th session to renew their determination to work together for the benefit of mankind and to recommit themselves to the cardinal principle of multilateralism. The role of multilateralism and the United Nations has therefore become ever more important. It is morally imperative that we unite our wills and pool our efforts for the well-being of humanity. Mr. President, just recently, Lesotho was among the 45 countries that presented their voluntary national reviews during the high-level political forum on sustainable development. Among other things, our review highlighted the pressing challenge of climate change, which has a direct bearing on food insecurity and poverty, not only in my country, but in Africa as a whole. Climate change destroys our ecosystems and results in land degradation, as well as contribute to the decline of agricultural productivity, which is the mainstay of small economies. In this connection, my delegation calls upon all member states to use the COP27 meeting to be held on African soil this time around as an opportune time to address Africa's challenges on climate change, as well as support our needs and priorities in the form of affordable and sustainable energy, capacity adaptation, and mitigation. We disagreed for far too long on the subject of climate change until we were confronted by the clearing and compelling scientific evidence that the link between global warming and human activity is indisputable. Sadly, catastrophes have begun to hit, mostly affecting the poorest and most vulnerable countries. While we appreciate that there are resources aimed at helping developing countries to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change, we are concerned that such funds are very difficult to access. The global climate finance architecture is complex, with variable structures of governance and modalities. Some finance is channeled through multilateral agencies, sometimes even outside the funding mechanisms of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and some flows through bilateral development assistance institutions, thereby making coordination very difficult. Lesotho calls on the international community and our development partners to simplify the accessibility of funds earmarked for climate change. Mr. President, the state of peace and security in the world is gradually getting worse, with recurring conflicts and eruption of new ones in many parts of the world. The emergence of new extremist groups and terrorist entities has not only compounded the problem, but is a stark reminder that we must act collectively to discharge the moral responsibility resting on us to ensure that people everywhere enjoy the right to peace and enjoy the right to development and the sanctity of life. The use of military force alone as a strategy for combating terrorism has never been panacea for eradicating that menace. Terrorism requires a holistic approach that addresses its root causes. Similarly, we as leaders should not turn a blind eye on the plight of civilians in all conflict areas. The international community should be consistent in dealing with the humanitarian crisis in different parts of the world. We do not derive any comfort, Mr. President, from the simmering trade and political tensions between two of the founding members of the United Nations, namely the United States of America and the People's Republic of China. We must remember that we came together as members of the United Nations under the premise that we are all peace-loving nations. The United Nations Charter enjoins us to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors, and to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security, and to employ international machinery for the promotion of economic and social advancement of our peoples. In this regard, we call upon these two great nations to show their fidelity to the principles underpinning our organization and to resolve their differences amicably. Military power and aggression can never beget peace. In the same vein, the ongoing war in Ukraine and other parts of the world inflict a reputational carnage on our beloved organization. Whereas peaceful settlement of disputes lies at the heart of the work of the United Nations, we have, however, not sufficiently utilized tools at our disposal, such as mediation for solving conflicts between and among member states. Some take sides and support conflicts in one form or another, while others remain in hibernation. Lesotho therefore wishes to implore the United Nations, particularly the Security Council, to live up to its charter and be an honest and impartial mediator in conflicts. The resolution of international disputes based on dialogue, justice, and the equality of all states must be at the heart of that strategy if it is to succeed. We must shun those who fan the flames of discord amongst us, and indeed we must not allow ourselves to entertain any thoughts that through divisions there will be one side that will win. We will all perish and be on the precipice. We are mindful, however, that it will be difficult for the Security Council to effectively discharge its mandate while it remains an epitome of the 1945 architecture of the world as seen by the victors of the Second World War. The reform of the United Nations, including the Security Council, can no longer be delayed. A reformed, transparent, and more democratic United Nations, in which Africa is represented along the lines of the Ezulwini Consensus, is necessary for preserving international peace and security and for confronting the challenges of development. All member states need to garner the necessary political will to advance the intergovernmental negotiations on the Security Council reform. We note with satisfaction the statement by President Biden delivered before this August House on the 21st of September 2022, in which he clearly articulated America's support for representation of Africa and other underrepresented regions in the United Nations Security Council, particularly in the permanent category. Let us make the 77th session one for decisive action on this matter. Mr. President, today we see the heightened geopolitical tensions that have led to the re-emergence of protectionist trade policies. The economic war in terms of sanctions has the potential to make global supply chains less efficient, subtracting from long-term growth and adding pressures on prices. This state of affairs flies in the face of the resolve of the representatives who gathered in San Francisco to finalize the Charter of the United Nations more than 7 decades ago, and who dreamed of a world of equality and shared prosperity. They renounced a vision of a world of unilaterally imposed economic sanctions and financial blockages against others, or one in which peoples are denied their right to self-determination or were subjected to occupation. It would therefore be remiss of me not to unequivocally call for the lifting of all economic and political sanctions against Zimbabwe. In the like manner, we express solidarity with the tenacious people of Cuba for having endured economic sanctions for so many years. We are confident that the United States of America, under the leadership of President Biden, will revisit its position on the embargo against the Republic of Cuba, and expand cooperation with Cuba on areas of mutual interest, including on trade and commerce, for the benefit of the peoples of both countries. This, the United States did in 2016 through the Presidential Policy Directive, and it can surely do it again. We also want to express our unwavering solidarity with the people of Western Sahara, who have languished under the hegemony of colonialism for far too long. I also wish to underline, in particular, the General Assembly Resolution 40/50 of 2nd December 1985, in terms of which the Assembly reaffirmed the fact that the question of Western Sahara was a question of decolonization, which remained to be completed on the basis of the exercise by the people of Western Sahara of their inalienable right to self-determination and independence. Equally, the United Nations Security Council, in its resolution 1920 of 2010, 1979 of 2011, and 2044 of 2012, recognized that the consolidation of the status quo in Western Sahara was unacceptable and called for an intensified pace of meetings and strengthening of contacts between the parties in order to advance the organization of the referendum. We call upon the international community to intensify efforts to bring to an end the question of Western Sahara. In the same vein, we express our unwavering support for the people of Palestine. Since the founding of the UN, the question of Palestine has been at the center of the agenda of our organization. Yet today, the Palestinian territory still remains under foreign occupation and its people endure untold pain and suffering. We call on the United Nations to intensify its efforts to achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting settlement of the question of Palestine. Mr. President, allow me to conclude my remarks by pointing out that the regime of the Charter of the United Nations has so far done its part in preventing a third world war, thereby fulfilling one of the dreams of the architects of our beloved organization. The continued success and the relevance of the United Nations will depend in large measure on its capacity for self-renewal and in readiness to meet modern-day challenges. We, the United Nations, should continue to be the voice of the voiceless and the best hope for all mankind. Now is the time for leaders everywhere to join the race for transformative action that can drive peace, democracy, respect for human rights, and the rule of law, as well as human dignity, economic competitiveness, and sustainable prosperity for all. Lesotho will continue to be persistent and a resilient part of that initiative. I thank you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Lesotho for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. And now the Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Adriano Afonso Malayane, Prime Minister of the Republic of Mozambique. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. I have a great pleasure in welcoming His Excellency Adriano Afonso Malayane, Prime Minister of the Republic of Mozambique, and I invite him to address the Assembly.
Senhor Presidente,
Mr. President,
Senhor Secretário-Geral das
Mr.
Nações
Secretary
Unidas,
General of the United Nations, His Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, distinguished Heads of Delegations, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen,
é com elevada honra
I am highly honored to participate in this 77th session of the General Assembly on behalf of His Excellency Felipe Jacinto Nyusi, President of the Republic of Mozambique, who, for agenda reasons, cannot be present.
Felicitamos a Sua Excelência, o Embaixador
I would like to congratulate His Excellency Ambassador Kisaba Korosi upon his election as President of the current session of the United Nations General Assembly. I wish him much success in this mission.
Expressamos o nosso profundo reconhecimento pelo trabalho realizado por seu antecessor, Sua Excelência Abdul Said, sobretudo no que concerne ao esforço de mecanismos multilaterais de apoio aos Estados-membros na resposta aos desafios globais relativos à Covid-19. À Sua Excelência António Guterres,
To His Excellency Mr. António Guterres, United Nations Secretary General,
pela forma abnegada que tem caracterizado a sua liderança nesta nossa importante organização mundial. Em nome do povo moçambicano, agradecemos
allow me also, on behalf of the Mozambican people, to thank you all, United Nations member states, for the support which contributed for the election of Mozambique as non-permanent member of the Security Council for the term 2023-2024.
Assumimos com muita responsabilidade a nossa eleição e gostaríamos de reafirmar que durante o nosso mandato, conforme o lema da nossa candidatura, paz e segurança internacionais e desenvolvimento sustentável, iremos defender, entre outras matérias, diálogo e resolução pacífica dos conflitos, promoção de ações de prevenção e manutenção da paz, luta contra o terrorismo, a advocacia do multilateralismo, o nexo entre as mudanças climáticas e a paz e segurança. Senhor Presidente, Excelências, o lema escolhido para a presente sessão da Assembleia Geral é revelador do reconhecimento comum de que a comunidade internacional está a passar por situações adversas e desafiantes, caracterizadas por uma multiplicidade de crises interligadas. Das várias adversidades que o mundo enfrenta atualmente, podemos destacar a Covid-19, as mudanças climáticas e as crises humanitárias, fenómenos que ameaçam a economia global. O surgimento de novos focos de tensões e conflitos internos e entre Estados, o terrorismo e o crime organizado internacional afetam negativamente a perspectiva de crescimento e desenvolvimento econômico e social, agravando a crise alimentar, energética, humanitária e o funcionamento da cadeia de abastecimento dos mercados internacionais. É por esta razão que Moçambique defende a necessidade de se continuar a apostar no diálogo construtivo e permanente e em ações multilaterais concertadas por estes serem os únicos caminhos para a preservação da paz e a contínua promoção do desenvolvimento socioeconômico sustentável dos nossos países. Minhas senhoras, meus senhores, Moçambique considera os Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentável 2030, uma agenda relevante para a reflexão sobre soluções coletivas para enfrentarmos o desafio deste tempo de mudanças, que, por sinal, é o lema desta sessão. A nossa experiência indica que a incorporação dos objetivos da agenda nas prioridades e pilares do nosso programa de governação tem trazido resultados assinaláveis no aumento da renda das famílias, fonte importante para o combate à pobreza, sendo de destacar o aumento de produção e produtividade no setor agrário, aliada à aposta no desenvolvimento de toda a cadeia de valor. Cobertura de abastecimento de água potável à população, e em particular nas zonas rurais. População com acesso à energia elétrica, cobertura de rede escolar de ensino primário, secundário, técnico profissional e superior, taxas de acesso e retenção de rapariga na escola, particularmente nas zonas rurais, e cuidados de saúde primária e dos programas de vacinação de crianças, assim como os cuidados da saúde materno-infantil. Destacamos igualmente a expansão dos serviços da administração da justiça, assegurando a melhoria do acesso do cidadão à justiça. Temos vindo ainda a promover ações no âmbito da economia azul, bem como a proteção e conservação do meio ambiente e dos ecossistemas terrestres, lacustres e marinhos. Contudo, a nossa experiência mostra ainda que precisamos de repensar um modelo institucional multilateral de financiamento que permita a mobilização de mais recursos para complementar os esforços internos para o alcance das metas do Objetivo de Desenvolvimento Sustentável. Minhas senhoras, meus senhores, no âmbito de prevenção e combate Covid-19, o governo de Moçambique adotou um conjunto de medidas de contenção da propagação da pandemia que permitiram assegurar o equilíbrio entre salvar vidas humanas e manter a economia em funcionamento. Entre algumas dessas medidas, destacamos a vacinação massiva da população contra esta doença, tendo sido vacinados até o momento 96,6% de cidadãos moçambicanos maiores de 18 anos de idade. Excelências, a inclusão de Covid-19 e as ações para a sua prevenção e
There are
combate,
lessons we draw
como
from
em
the
todas
fight
as
and
crises,
prevention of
deixaram algumas
COVID-19
lições para cada um dos nossos países,
for each of our
das quais
countries.
gostaríamos de destacar
I
a
would
necessidade
highlight the
de
need
termos
for
sistemas
to have
nacionais de
national
saúde
health
preparados
systems prepared
para
to
responder às
respond to
crises
health
sanitárias,
crises,
o que passa
which
pela
involves the
disponibilização
provision
e acesso
and universal
universal
access
a
to
equipamentos
medical
médicos
equipment
e meios necessários
and means
para a prevenção
necessary
e
for
tratamento.
prevention and treatment.
Financiamento à altura de responder efetivamente às emergências da saúde pública. Reforço à educação e formação profissional de profissionais de saúde
Strengthening
e
education
reforço da
and
cooperação
training of
bilateral
health
e
professionals and
multilateral,
strengthening
assim
bilateral
como
and
uma maior
multilateral
interação e
cooperation,
diálogo
as well as
entre
greater
atores públicos
interaction
e
and
privados
dialogue
para
between
responder
public
com
and
maior
private
eficácia
actors
às crises
to respond
com
more
impacto
effectively to
global.
crises with global
Senhor
impact.
Presidente,
Mr. President,
Excelências,
Excellencies,
as mudanças climáticas colocam Moçambique em vigilância
climate change places
permanente.
Mozambique under permanent
Nos últimos
surveillance.
tempos, o nosso país
In
tem
recent
sido
times,
afetado de
our
forma
country has been
cíclica e intensa
cyclically
por
and intensively
depressões,
affected by
ciclones
depressions,
tropicais,
tropical
chuvas
cyclones,
e eventos
rains,
fortes,
and
inundações
strong
e secas
winds,
que
floods
têm
and droughts
provocado a perda de
that
vidas
have
humanas,
caused loss of human
destacado
lives, displacement of
ao
persons,
resultado danos em infraestruturas
extensive
e
damage to
atividades
infrastructure
socioeconómicas, sendo de
and
destacar no período entre
socio-economic
2019 e
activities. Just between
2022,
2019 and
ciclones
2022,
Idai,
Mozambique was
Kenneth,
hit by
Gwambe,
cyclones
Shalane,
Idai,
Ana e
Kenneth,
Gombe.
Gwambe, Shalane, Ana
Para
and
responder aos
Gombe.
desafios atinentes à redução e gestão de risco de desastres
In order to
naturais,
respond to the
Moçambique,
challenges
em
related
coordenação com os
to the
países da
reduction
região
and
austral,
risk management
da
of
África
natural
e parceiros de
disasters,
cooperação, estabeleceu em
Mozambique, in
2021,
coordination with
na
the
cidade
countries
portuária
of the
de
southern
Macala,
region of
no norte
Africa
do país,
and
o
cooperation
Centro de
partners,
Operações
established in
Humanitárias e de
2021
Emergência da
in
Comunidade
the
de
Nacala
Desenvolvimento
Porto,
da África Austral.
north of the
SADC.
country, the Center for
Estabelecimento
Humanitarian and
deste
Emergency
centro
Operations
visa dotar
of the
os
Southern
países da
African
SADC
Development
de
Community.
instrumentos e
The
instituições
center is
capazes
aimed to
de
provide
responder e
SADC
mitigar
countries with
os impactos
tools and
das mudanças
institutions
climáticas
capable of responding
e
to
outras
and
emergências
mitigating
que
the
requerem
impacts of
uma
climate
intervenção
change
rápida,
and other
coordenada
emergencies
e
requiring
atempada em qualquer
rapid,
Estado-membro.
coordinated, and
Reiteramos
timely
o compromisso de
intervention
Moçambique
in any
de
member
continuar
state.
a tomar medidas para fortalecer
Mozambique is
a
committed
segurança
to continue strengthening
climática,
climate security,
incluindo a advocacia
including
e a divulgação de boas práticas
advocacy
de
and
proteção do
dissemination
meio
of
ambiente,
good
gestão e
environmental
redução do risco
protection
de desastres
practices,
naturais.
management, and risk reduction
Estas ações
of natural disasters.
reforçam o papel que Sua Excelência Felipe Jacinto Inhofe,
These actions
Presidente da
reinforce the
República
role
de
that His
Moçambique, vem
Excellency
desempenhando
Felipe
na
Jacinto
sua qualidade
Nyusi,
de
President of
campeão
the
de gestão do
Republic
risco
of
de desastres em
Mozambique, has
África,
been playing
missão
in his capacity
atribuída
as
pela União
champion of
Africana.
disaster risk management
neste
in
âmbito
Africa,
que
a
apelamos
mission
à comunidade
assigned by the
internacional
African Union.
a se juntar
In this
ao
vein,
esforço
we
de
call
Moçambique
on
e
the
de todos os
international
países da
community
África,
to join our
de modo a
efforts
que
so that
possamos
we continue
continuar
to build
a criar
resilience
resiliência
and
e capacidade
adaptation capacity
adaptativa aos
to address the
efeitos das
effects of
mudanças
climate
climáticas
change,
em
in
consonância com
line
os
with
compromissos
the commitments
assumidos
made
no
in
Acordo
the
de
Paris
Paris
Agreement
e no quadro de
and the
Sendai.
Sendai Framework.
Senhor Presidente, Excelência,
Mr.
no
President,
quadro da consolidação da
Excellencies,
paz
with
e
regards to
reconciliação nacional,
consolidation of national
Moçambique
peace
tem
and
vindo a
reconciliation,
registrar
Mozambique
progressos
has made
assinaláveis no que
remarkable
concerne
progress
ao
in the
processo
process
de
of
desarmamento,
disarmament,
desmobilização e
demobilization
reintegração,
and
denominados
reintegration
DDR,
of former
dos antigos guerrilheiros da RENAM.
Renamo
Até o presente
guerrillas.
momento, foram abrangidos por este processo
date,
4.002 antigos guerrilheiros da RENAM, de
4,002
total de
former Renamo guerrillas
5.221.
of a total of 5,221
Prevemos, até o final
have been
do
covered
presente ano,
by this process.
a conclusão do
We
processo
foresee by the end
de
of this year the
DDR,
conclusion
o
of the
que
DDR process,
constituirá
which
marco
will be an
importante
important
da
milestone
implementação do
in
Acordo
the
de Paz
implementation of
e
the National
Reconciliação
Peace
Nacional,
and
assinado a 6
Reconciliation
de agosto
Agreement
de
signed on
2019
August 6,
entre o governo de
2019,
Moçambique e a
between
RENAM.
the government of
Com a conclusão
Mozambique
desta
and
etapa,
Renamo.
mudará o foco para uma reintegração de longo prazo e uma reconciliação mais efetiva, fatores essenciais para garantir a sustentabilidade do processo de paz e de consolidação da unidade nacional. Os progressos assinalados estamos a registrar no âmbito do DDR contam com inestimável assistência e apoio das Nações Unidas e do secretário-geral desta organização, assim como do grupo de contato, para prevenir e combater as ações terroristas em alguns distritos da província de Cabo Delgado. O governo tem vindo a adotar uma abordagem abrangente que inclui reforço da capacidade operativa das forças de defesa e segurança, estabilização da segurança e criação de condições que permitam a recuperação, construção e desenvolvimento socioeconômico, de modo a reduzir os fatores de vulnerabilidade das comunidades ao extremismo violento. Mercê das ações levadas a cabo por Moçambique, conjugado com apoio e assistência dos parceiros de cooperação multilaterais e bilaterais, entre os quais SADC, União Europeia e o Ruanda, temos vindo a registrar avanços no combate ao terrorismo. Esta abordagem de Moçambique é pioneira em termos de uma ação regional concertada para enfrentar uma ameaça global que é o terrorismo. As ações em curso no terreno estão a permitir a reposição de segurança e, consequentemente, o regresso gradual da população às suas zonas de origem e retoma da atividade econômica e social nas regiões outrora afetadas pelas ações terroristas, através da implementação do programa de reconstrução de Cabo Delgado. Manifestamos o nosso apreço
So I wish to express our appreciation to all those who directly or indirectly have supported Mozambique in the prevention and combat against terrorism, in providing humanitarian assistance and in rebuilding the economic and social fabric of the affected areas. Mr. President, Excellency,
reiteramos o compromisso de Moçambique
at the service of the Security Council as now permanent member, I reaffirm Mozambique's commitment
das Nações Unidas de defender os objetivos e a missão das Nações Unidas em estreita colaboração e coordenação de todos os membros.
We will listen and work in close collaboration and coordination with all UN member states. Thank you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the Prime Minister of the Republic of Mozambique for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. The Assembly will hear now an address by His Excellency Edi Rama, Prime Minister of the Republic of Albania. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. I have a great pleasure in welcoming His Excellency Edi Rama, Prime Minister of the Republic of Albania, and I invite him to address the Assembly.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, it is a particular honor for me to address this session of the United Nations General Assembly because I stand here as the representative of a country, Albania, that is currently serving in the Security Council for the first time in its history. This responsibility lends special importance to our role in this august body and beyond. We gather here each September, and 77 years on, the United Nations has only gained in its universal appeal, serving as a parliament of humankind, the forum where we speak to each other and listen to the world. Like nowhere else, the world converges here. We share the success and progress, outline issues and challenges, express worries and fears, highlight crises and tensions, talk about agreements and discords, but above all, we bring a joint desire for a better world. In these nearly 8 decades, we have witnessed uninterrupted change, profound transformation, unprecedented mobilization, continued solidarity, and an all-time imperative of the need to work together. As a result, the world has known undeniable progress on many tracks. On the other hand, we must never forget that our journey has been bumpy. Many times, we have also witnessed terrible setbacks and even reversal of progress. Unfortunately, this is mainly due to man-made catastrophes, ill-conceived policies, because of narrow national politics, short-sighted interests, fueled by populism, nationalism, and greed for domination. This is why this place at this time each year is the yearly checkup of the health of the world. We may sometimes have the impression that we say too much of the same things, that we needlessly repeat each other too often. I would like to disagree. If committing to peace and security, to development and prosperity, to upholding the international law or inspecting human rights, engage into genuine efforts to mitigate climate change, is repeating each other, then we are doing the very right thing. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, this year, our hopes and beliefs have been bitterly shattered, and our assurances were broken by an unprovoked, unjustified, and premeditated war of one country against another in the European continent, the brutal aggression of Russia against its neighbor, Ukraine. Russia's war of choice is against Ukraine and its people, but not only. It is also a brutal assault against international law, a flagrant violation of the UN Charter, and a very direct threat to the European security architecture. It is an open battle between an aging, cynical tyranny and a young, growing democracy. While we all, in our ways and with our respective means, try individually and collectively to project ourselves into the future, one country, led by an illusion of grandeur from bygone times, has decided to drag the world backwards, go against everything we have built over decades. This is unacceptable. We'll continue to stand in full solidarity with Ukraine and its people, and just like many other countries, help them in any way we can to defend themselves. Their fight is also ours, and I hope that all of the members of the United Nations that share the core principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, freedom, and the right to independently decide on their future without fear or interference, shying away from this defining battle between those principles and all their contrary, is shying away from the duty to protect ourselves, our countries, our children, our world. While the world expects Russia to come to reason, stop the war and engage into peace negotiations, just a few days ago, Kremlin made another choice, that of escalation, announcing a partial mobilization which would deepen the conflict, bring more crimes, more victims, more misery, but also more shame on Russia itself. Sham referendums are being conducted in some parts of the occupied Ukrainian territory with the threat of a gun. It is hard to imagine that anyone here can silently accept such disgraceful disregard of laws, rules, norms, and practices that govern relations between states in the 21st century. These actions run against international law and not only do not reflect the free will of the Ukrainian people, but offer a miserable show of the detachment from everything that brings us together under the roof of the United Nations. We condemn such actions engineered in Moscow, and we will not recognize any such unlawfulness. In the world we want, impunity should not be the shelter of those who must answer for their deeds. Albania is fully committed to accountability globally and fight impunity everywhere. This is to provide justice to victims, but also to prevent future atrocities. That is why Albania calls and supports the work towards the adoption of a convention on the prevention and punishment of crimes against humanity. This new instrument would fill a significant gap in the current international framework and facilitate international cooperation to protect civilians. Mr. President, the world is never a quiet place, and there are many serious challenges that need to be properly and immediately addressed. We face serious challenges with open conflict in many parts of the world. Many countries are subject to intolerable seizure of power by force. Terrorism remains a serious threat against peace and security. At a time when a multitude of crises have put the world in turmoil, including by unacceptable nuclear threats, I would like to call the attention of the Assembly on another crucial issue closely linked and with huge impact on peace and security: cybersecurity. Technology is nowadays part of every aspect of our life. In Albania, 95% of services to the citizens and business are offered online. These user-friendly systems save time, energy, and drastically improve efficiency, quality, by being also the best tool to eliminate endemic corruption. But last July, Albania was the target of an unprovoked large-scale cyber attack. The entire government digital infrastructure was under a sustained and coordinated assault with a clear aim to destroy it, paralyze public services, and steal data and electronic communications from government systems, create chaos and foment tensions in the country. A lengthy and thorough, in-depth investigation conducted in cooperation with the best existing world expertise on cyber terrorism has now confirmed beyond any doubt that the cyber attack that wanted to bring a sovereign country to its knees was a state-sponsored aggression orchestrated and carried out by the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is why, in face of such a blatant breach of norms responsible for state behavior in cyberspace in peacetime, which include refraining from damaging crucial infrastructure that provides service to the public, the government of Albania was left with no other choice but sever the diplomatic relations with Iran. We hope this forced extreme measure will be an example and a deterrent for anyone who supports or sponsors such abhorring actions against sovereign state. We urge the United Nations, including the Security Council, to focus more seriously and concretely to address cybersecurity by investing in prevention and help all member states build resilience. Ladies and gentlemen, Albania is a member of the Balkans community, a part of Europe that has had its share of very troubled history. Mention the word Balkans, and I bet in everyone's mind come the images stained by bloody wars and brutal crimes. You'd rightfully recall the scars of repression and oppression, genocide in Srebrenica, and brutal ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. Nothing of this is or will be forgotten. Accountability has and will continue, and we must double our efforts to guarantee its unhindered course. This requires a resolved commitment to the ideals of justice and, above all, cooperation between parties. Justice lies in the foundations of any effort for long-lasting peace, stability, and prosperity. But justice is served with facts, with proofs and evidence, not with fiction or distorted reality And I cannot but share with you here a terrible example, which should be a lesson for all the world and first and foremost the democratic world. In 2011, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe adopted a report compiled by a zealous parliamentarian who goes by the name Dick Marty, accusing the Kosovo Liberation Army of the despicable crime of organ trafficking. Mr. Marty should have been paid as a storyteller, but never trusted as a rapporteur of the Council of Europe. His report was shocking, and not only many believed it then, but it became the key factor in enhancing the idea and in establishing Kosovo specialist chambers. It also became one of the worst cases of distorted reality, the kind of manifesto for worldwide propaganda against Kosovo independence. Every investigative effort was made during these long 11 years to prove these allegations nationally, regionally, and internationally. No avail. Nothing. Not a single shred of evidence or proof was found anywhere in Kosovo or anywhere else regarding alleged trafficking of organs. Yet, the Kosovo Specialist Chambers that were founded based on that report have, as we speak, arrested without indictment Kosovo's sitting president Hashim Thaçi. He waited a year in detention until he was formally indicted. Just try now, please, all of you, to imagine, for a moment, your president or prime minister, your country leader, taken away from office in a third country, kept there in custody for a whole year without any formal indictment by a body created and sponsored from a community of democratic countries. And guess what? Not a single word of the entire indictment that comes next has anything to do with the Council of Europe report on the alleged crime of organ trafficking. A full fantasy. Isn't this a monumental failure of international politics? And this is not about a person. It's not about a court procedure. This is about taking of the induced stain on a country and its history. Nevertheless, exactly because democracy and its institutions have among many virtues that of repairing their faults and errors, we strongly believe that based on this crying lack of evidence whatsoever, precisely the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe will honor the truth and will accept Albania's request to produce a follow-up report, and while damage has been done, help restore the credibility of such an important international organization as the Council of Europe. We will never give up on this truth, and we will not stop honoring all of them who gave their life for their freedom and their independence, and on whom nobody, in the name of anybody, can throw a single piece of dirt. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll say a few more words on the Balkans, not of the past, but for the future, that one that we are working to build together in our region. Turn this region in any way, and you will find a lot of fuel for division and toxicity. But we in Albania have realized that the best way to advance is to do it together, with shared benefits as sovereign countries, but close partners. As national players joined by a common enterprise, with our specific interests as part of a common framework, the one that responds to our citizens. This brought us together with North Macedonia and Serbia to launch the Open Balkans Initiative, a platform open to all Balkan countries not only the three of us, but Montenegro and Kosovo, Bosnia and Turkey, Greece and further, an investment for everyone as part of the wider common European project. The best message of the Open Balkan that I want to share with you today is that you don't need to agree on everything to leave behind the dark past and build step by step a common bright future. By dealing with your disagreements in more and more gracious way, and by finding more and more the reasons, the good ones, to solve also the disagreements. So, by strengthening this relation with Serbia and moving forward together to boost bilateral and regional cooperation, Albania has not and will not move an inch from its firm position in support of a need for every country that has not yet done so, among all of you, including Serbia first and foremost, to recognize the Republic of Kosovo. This being said, it is high time for Kosovo and Serbia to move beyond the current stalemate in their dialogue and work bravely towards a comprehensive peace agreement by doing their respective part to adopt a EU-US-backed breakthrough. Dialogue is not just a better way. It is the sole and unique way to deal with issues, however difficult they appear, however complex they are. And I remain convinced that Open Balkans will only help facilitate this process to the benefit of all, Albanians and Serbs, Kosovo and Serbia, but also for the entire region and the wider Europe. Mr. President, let me conclude with a beautiful African proverb that says it all about our United Nations. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Thank you all.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the Prime Minister of the Republic of Albania for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. And now the Assembly will hear an address by His Eminence Cardinal Pietro Parolin, Secretary of State of the Holy See. I request protocol to escort His Eminence. I have a great pleasure in welcoming His Eminence Cardinal Pietro Parolin, Secretary of State of the Holy See. And I invite him to address the Assembly.
Mr. President, I am pleased to extend to you and to the representatives of nations gathered here the warm greetings of Pope Francis. It is good to be together again in person. Last year, I spoke of the dark clouds hanging over humanity. While some of those have lifted, other darker clouds have gathered. Armed conflicts currently afflicts our world to an extent not seen since 1945. In addition to the misery caused by violence and cruelty, and the anxiety arising from the threat of nuclear escalation, our world continues to face the challenges of climate change, mixed migration, and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, while food insecurity and water scarcity now affect large portions of the global population. No one can deny that the great challenges of our times are all global. At the same time, alongside the greater interconnections of problems, we are seeing a growing fragmentation of solutions, which only fuels further tensions and divisions, as well as a generalized feeling of uncertainty and instability. We need to recover our sense of shared identity as a single human family. If we do not focus on what unites us, seeking to promote the common good, there will only be growing isolation, marked by a reciprocal rejection and refusal that endangers multilateralism. Indeed, here at the United Nations, we are called to work together to restore, as Pope Francis requested, that diplomatic style that has characterized international relations from the end of the Second World War, making sure it is best able to implement its foundational charter and respond to the challenges faced by humanity. Mr. President, when Pope St. Paul VI visited this chamber, his heartfelt plea was broadcast around the world. Jamais plus la guerre, no more war. Decades later, the hard-fought progress in reducing the prevalence of armed conflict globally has been questioned. This reversal deeply concerns the Holy See. Pope Francis recognized that, unfortunately, we never learn, and the old story of competition between the greater powers continues, seeking to extend economic, ideological, and military influence. And yet, the Holy See strongly believes in multilateralism and the irreplaceable role of the United Nations. For that reason, Pope Francis speaks repeatedly in support of this organization, encouraging a process of renewal. Mr. President, this General Assembly has been working on the revitalization on various aspects of this work for some time. This process takes place against the backdrop of a crisis of credibility arising not only from its apparent impotence in times of crisis, but also from the promotion of agenda in many fora that frequently shift the focus to matters that, by their divisive nature, do not strictly belong to the aims of the organization. Pope Francis called this ideological colonization. Unfortunately, key decisions are now frequently made without a genuine process of negotiation in which all countries have a say. This is at odds with the true nature of multilateral diplomacy. Unfortunately, international cooperation is hindered by the flagrant imposition of contentious policies which do not enjoy agreement, particularly in the area of human rights. In this regard, there appears to be little desire on the part of specific states to recover consensus and authentic dialogue. Indeed, today it would appear that only the powerful and the well-funded prevail, reinventing human rights as they see fit. Instead, the fundamental human rights recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are firmly rooted in universal values, such that the right to life, to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, opinion, and expression, and that the institution of the family is protected. The Holy See reaffirms that human rights remain universal, objective, and firmly rooted in the God-given dignity of the human person. It is imperative that broad agreement and genuine consensus be found again soon within this organization, if it is to restore its international credibility as a true family of nations. It must extend beyond the General Assembly to the reform of those organs with effective executive capability, such as the Security Council. The landmark resolution requiring that the use of veto power be explained before the General Assembly was a welcome step in this direction. The members of the Security Council, most especially the permanent members, hold a crucial responsibility for the maintenance of peace and order in the world. When there is no shared vision or political will for peaceful coexistence, they become themselves the perpetrators of grave injustices. Only when the representatives of nations gathered here are able to place the common good above their own partisan interest will the legal framework of the United Nations system truly be the pledge of a secure and happy future. At present, however, violence continues to scar our world. The devastation that war wreaks directly upon the populations of conflict zones is compounded by the indirect impact on countless other people far from the front line. As Pope Francis has pointed out, war diverts attention and resources, but these are the objectives that demand the utmost commitment. The fight against hunger, health and education, world hunger, food insecurity and malnutrition in all its forms are alarmingly on the rise. The number of people suffering hunger in the world has risen to as many as 828 million in 2021. However, expenditure on arms, today at obscene levels only serves to increase food insecurity, restrict access to health care, and deprive generations of their rightful education. It is time to bring an end to armament hypocrisy, speaking of peace and living off weapons. Instead of squandering vast sums on military equipment, it would be far wiser to invest in avoiding war rather than preparing for it. Mr. President, the war in Ukraine has exacerbated already concerning global trends, including rising food and fuel prices and increased displacement. The conflict has also brought renewed attention to nuclear security and the risk of nuclear escalation. With the onset of conflict, a key source of staple grains and cooking oil for countries that rely on food imports was interrupted, placing millions more at risk of food insecurity and starvation. Additionally, the war has also exposed the vulnerability of short-sighted energy policies that rely exclusively on the single source of fossil fuel, rather than developing clean and sustainable alternatives. It is the poorest among us who suffer the most. Addressing this crisis requires urgent and concerted action. Furthermore, the war in Ukraine not only undermines the nuclear non-proliferation regime, but also presents us with the danger of nuclear devastation, either through escalation or accident. Any threat of nuclear weapons use is repugnant and merits unequivocal condemnation. In the meantime, Europe's largest refugee crisis since the Second World War only adds to the millions of refugees throughout Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Mixed migration is a global phenomenon which needs to be addressed accordingly. In this regard, implementing the vision and objectives of both the Global Compact for safe, regular, and orderly migration, as well as the Global Compact on refugees, remain among the best ways to encourage the international cooperation and burden sharing. States must continue making every effort to generate the necessary conditions for people to live in peace, security, and dignity in their countries of origin. Mr. President, our common home continues to be gravely affected by the adverse impacts of climate change. Indeed, we have grown so used to hearing of extreme weather events, and yet those phenomena are clear signs of our failure to address climate change. Moreover, multilateral environmental agreements have already laid out obligations for states party that would prove effective in tackling the threat posed by climate change. In this regard, when the international community gathers at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, it is to be hoped that there will be the political will to take more decisive and transformative decisions to protect the environment by accelerating global climate action through stronger mitigation measures, scaled-up adaptation efforts, and enhanced flows of appropriate finance. On this issue, I am pleased to note that the Holy See, acting in the name and on behalf of the Vatican City State, has recently deposited the instruments of accessions both to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and to the Paris Agreement to contribute to the efforts of all states to work together to respond effectively to challenges posed by climate change. The digital environment also demands greater attention, given the increasingly important role that information and communication technologies play in our daily lives. Pope Francis points out the potential of digital technologies, which is enormous. Yet the possible negative impact of this abuse in the area of human trafficking, the planning of terrorist activities, the spread of hatred and extremism, the manipulation of information, and in the area of child abuse is equally significant. Public opinion and lawmakers are finally coming to realize this. Mr. President, this is the logic of the appeal of Pope Francis to work together for peace, not a peace based on the balance of weapons or on mutual fear, but rather one born of encounter and dialogue. For this, it is necessary to pass from the strategies of political, economic, and military power to a plan for global peace. No to a world divided among conflicting powers, yes, to a world united among peoples and civilizations that respect each other. Thank you, Mr. President.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the Secretary of State of the Holy See for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Eminence. I now give the floor to His Excellency Wang Yi, State Councilor and Minister for Foreign Affairs of China.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, we are at a time fraught with challenges. COVID-19 has kept resurfacing. Global security faces uncertainty. Global economic recovery is fragile and unsteady, and various risks and crises are emerging. The world has entered a new phase of turbulence and transformation. Changes unseen in a century are accelerating. But we are also at a time full of hope. The world continues to move toward multipolarity, economic globalization is deepening, and our societies are becoming increasingly digitalized and culturally diverse. Countries are becoming ever more interconnected and interdependent. Peace and development remain the underlying trend of our times. People's call for progress and cooperation is getting louder. How should we respond to the call of our times and the ride trend of history to build a community with a shared future for mankind? China's answer is firm and clear. First, we must uphold peace and oppose war. President Xi Jinping notes that peace, like air and sunshine, is hardly noticed when we are benefited from it, but none of us can live without it. Peace is crucial for our future, and it underpins common security of all countries. Turbulence and war can only open Pandora's box, and he who instigates a proxy war can easily get himself burned. Pursuing one's own absolute security can only undermine global strategic stability. We must address differences by peaceful means and resolve disputes through dialogue and consultation. Second, we must pursue development and eliminate poverty. Development holds the key to resolving difficult issues and delivering a happy life to our people. We should place development at the center of the international agenda, build international consensus on promoting development, and upholding all countries' legitimate right to development. We should, fostering new drivers for global development, forge a global development partnership, and see that everyone in every country benefits more from the fruits of development in a more equitable way. Third, we must remain open and oppose exclusion. President Xi pointed out that openness is the sure way to human prosperity and advancement. Protectionism can only boomerang, and decoupling and supply chain disruption will hurt everyone. We should stay true to openness and inclusiveness and tear down fences and barriers that hinder the free flow of vectors of production. We should uphold the WTO-centered multilateral trading system and work for an open world economy. Fourth, we must seek cooperation and oppose confrontation. As we face a host of global challenges, our biggest strength will come from solidarity. Our best strategy is to stick together, and the only way forward is through win-win cooperation. It is natural that countries might have their differences and problems, but they should increase mutual understanding on the basis of equality and respect. We should engage in dialogue, consultation, and win-win cooperation, and reject conflict, coercion, and zero-sum game. We should jointly oppose group politics and bloc confrontation. Fifth, we must strengthen solidarity and oppose division. President Xi stated, the countries around the world are like passengers on the same ship who share a common stake. All of us should pull together to navigate the ship through storm toward a bright future. Our world must embrace diverse civilizations in order to make continuous advances, and mankind must pursue an inclusive path in order to achieve modernization. Peace, development, fairness, justice, democracy, and freedom are common values of humanity. Difference in system should not be used as an excuse to create division. Still less should democracy and human rights be used as tools or weapons to achieve political ends. We should stand against drawing ideological lines and expand common ground to promote world peace and development. Sixth, we must uphold equity and oppose bullying. Mutual respect and equity of countries big and small is a primary principle of the UN Charter. Major international issues should be handled by all countries, and international rules drawn up by all countries together. No country is above others, and no country should abuse its power to bully other sovereign countries. We should advocate and practice true multilateralism, promote equity of all countries in terms of rights, rules, and opportunities, and build a new type of international relations featuring mutual respect, equity, and justice, and win-win cooperation. Mr. President, colleagues, China, as a permanent member of the Security Council and the world's largest developing country, is committed to solidarity and cooperation with other countries. We will follow the trend of the times and pursue the shared interests of the vast majority of countries. China has been engaging in building global peace. We have actively promoted international peace and participated in international arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation process. China is the top contributor of peacekeeping personnel among the P5, and it is the second largest founding contributor to both the UN and its peacekeeping operations. China is the only country in the world that pledges to keep to a path of peaceful development in its constitution. It is the only one among the 5 nuclear weapon states that is committed to no first use of nuclear weapons. It has thus made important contribution to global strategic stability. In response to the various security challenges, President Xi proposed the Global Security Initiative. He called on the international community to pursue common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, to abide by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, to take the legitimate security concerns of all countries seriously, to peacefully resolve disputes through dialogue and consultation, and to maintain security in both traditional and non-traditional domains, thus contributing China's vision to reducing the peace deficit facing humanity and providing China's input to meeting global security challenges. China has been contributing to global development. We have worked to build a system of high-standard opening up and keep the global industrial and supply chains secure and stable. China is a major trading partner of over 130 countries and regions. Contributing about 30% of annual global growth, China is the biggest engine driving the global economy. China is a pace setter in implementing the 2030 Agenda. It has met the poverty reduction goal 10 years ahead of schedule and accounts for over 70% of the gains in global poverty reduction. China is also an active participant in global governance and South-South cooperation. It has set up the China UN Peace and Development Trust Fund and the Global Development and South-South Cooperation Fund. It has provided development aid to more than 160 countries in need and extended more debt service payments owed by developing countries than any other G20 member. At the 76th UNGA session, President Xi proposed the Global Development Initiative. Putting the people front and center, the GDI is a rallying call to refocus global attention on development and build a global community of development. At the recent high-level dialogue on global development, President Xi announced dozens of major concrete steps to implement the GDI, generating strong impetus for accelerating the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. On the margins of this UNGA session, China hosted a ministerial meeting of the Group of Friends of the GDI, building more consensus on pursuing this initiative. As China forges ahead, its fast train of development will continue to drive global growth and deliver more benefits to people of all countries. China has been upholding the international order. We are committed to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, the UN-centered international system, and the international order based on international law. China has been involved in multilateral affairs in all fields. It is a member of almost all universal intergovernmental organizations and a party to over 600 international conventions. It has concluded more than 27,000 bilateral treaties and fulfilled in good faith its international obligations. China abides by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and has made relentless efforts to protect and strengthen its human rights. We stand firmly against attempts to politicize human rights and work to promote healthy development of international human rights cooperation. As a member of the developing world, China will forever stand with other developing countries. We are heartened to see the rapid progress achieved by the developing world in recent years, and we will continue to speak up for other developing countries, help them overcome difficulties, and support efforts to raise the representation and say of developing countries in international affairs. Developing countries are no longer the silent majority in international and multilateral processes. With stronger solidarity, China and other developing countries have spoken out for justice and become a pillar of promoting development cooperation and safeguarding equity and justice. China has been providing public goods. In the face of COVID-19, China has fully advanced and engaged in global cooperation against the virus. We have done our best to provide anti-COVID supplies and shared our practices on COVID response. China is among the first to promise making COVID vaccines a global public good and to support waiving intellectual property rights on the vaccines. China has provided over 2.2 billion doses of vaccines to more than 120 countries and international organizations. In response to tough challenges confronting global development, President Xi proposed to advance high-quality Belt and Road cooperation, an initiative widely endorsed by the international community. China has signed cooperation documents with 149 countries and 32 international organizations. We have set up the AIIB and the Silk Road Fund, thus building the broadest and most inclusive platforms for international cooperation. In response to the shared concerns about data security, we have launched the Global Initiative on Data Security as our contribution to formulating rules on global data security. In response to climate change, China is committed to a development path that puts ecological conservation first, one of green and low-carbon growth. We announced the ambitious carbon peaking and carbon neutrality goals and are working to implement the Paris Agreement. China accounts for 1/4 of all the trees planted globally. We are making unremitting efforts for a community of life for man and nature. In response to global food security challenges, China has put forth a cooperation initiative on global food security. This year, we have provided over 15,000 tons of emergency humanitarian food assistance to other developing countries in need. China has been mediating hotspot issues. As a responsible major country, China has explored workable Chinese approaches to solving hotspot issues. While adhering to the principle of non-interference and respecting the will and needs of the countries concerned, China has endeavored to help settle hotspot issues in a constructive way. Our approach is to promote peace through talks, which is fair and pragmatic and aims to address both the symptoms and root causes of hotspot issues. China supports all efforts conducive to the peaceful resolution of the Ukraine crisis. The pressing priority is to facilitate talks for peace. The fundamental solution is to address the legitimate security concerns of all parties and build a balanced, effective, and sustainable security architecture. We call on all parties concerned to keep the crisis from spilling over and protect the legitimate rights and interests of developing countries. The Palestinian question is at the heart of the Middle East issue. Justice is already late, but it must not be absent. The two-state solution is crucial for upholding fairness and justice. China will continue to support the Palestinian people in pursuing their just cause of restoring legitimate national rights. To resolve the Korean nuclear issue, it is important to address its root cause. We need to follow the dual-track approach and the principle of taking phased and synchronized steps, and jointly uphold peace and stability on the peninsula and resolve the issue through dialogue and consultation. Afghanistan is in a critical transition from chaos to order. The right way forward is to put in place an inclusive political framework and adopt moderate policies. The goal should be to resume economic growth and improve people's lives, with fighting terrorism and integrating into the region being the priorities. The few countries have arbitrarily imposed unilateral sanctions, cut off development aid and frozen lawful assets of other countries. This is an unacceptable practice that must be corrected. China firmly supports the Cuban people in their just struggle to defend their sovereignty and oppose external interference and blockade. The abuse of guns is becoming an increasingly serious problem across the world. China has decided to launch its domestic procedure to ratify the UN's Firearms Protocol, which will contribute to strengthening global cooperation on gun control and closing the security deficit. Mr. President, colleagues, since ancient times, Taiwan has been an inseparable part of China's territory. China's sovereignty and territorial integrity has never been severed, and the fact that the mainland and Taiwan belong to one and the same China has never changed. All of us Chinese have never ceased our efforts to realize reunification. It is explicitly stated in the Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Proclamation issued 70-odd years ago that all the territories Japan has stolen from the Chinese, including Taiwan and the Penghu Islands, shall be restored to China. This is an important part of the post-war international order. 51 years ago, right in this August hall, the General Assembly adopted Resolution 2758 with an overwhelming majority, which decided to restore the lawful seat of the PRC in the UN and to expel the representatives of the Taiwan authorities from the place they had unlawfully occupied. The so-called dual representation proposal put forth by the US and a few others to keep Taiwan's seat became nothing but a piece of paper. Once and for all, Resolution 2758 resolved politically, legally, and procedurally the issue of the representation of the whole of China, including Taiwan, in the UN and international institutions. Yet it completely blocked any attempt by anyone or any country to create two Chinas or one China, one Taiwan. The One China principle has become a basic norm in international relations and a consensus of the international community. When entering into diplomatic relations with China, 181 countries all recognized and accepted that there is but one China in the world and Taiwan is a part of China, and that the PRC government is the sole legal government representing the whole of China. By firmly upholding the One China principle, China is not only upholding its sovereignty and territorial integrity, but also truly safeguarding peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, the principle of non-interference, a basic norm in international relations that is vital for developing countries. China will continue to work for peaceful reunification with the greatest sincerity and efforts. To realize this goal, we must combat Taiwan independence separatist activities with the firmest resolve and take the most forceful steps to repulse external interference. Only by resolutely forestalling separatist activities can we forge a true foundation for peaceful reunification. Only when China is completely reunified can there be enduring peace across the Taiwan Strait. Any scheme to interfere in China's internal affairs is bound to meet the strong opposition of all Chinese, and any move to obstruct China's reunification is bound to be crushed by the wheels of history. The international community closely follows China's development. Since the 18th CPC National Congress 10 years ago, socialism with Chinese characteristics has entered a new era. In the past decade, China has made historic achievements and transformation in pursuing economic and social development. In this decade, it also realized a historic leap in its relations with the world and made historic contributions to the international community. China is fully implementing a new development philosophy of innovative, coordinated, green, and open development for all, and is pursuing high-quality development and fostering a new development paradigm. With the strong leadership of the CPC, concerted efforts of the 1.4 billion people, the strengths of socialism with Chinese characteristics, a solid foundation underpinning sustained rapid development, and strong confidence in achieving development through its own efforts, China will enjoy sustained and sound development, usher in even brighter prospects, and make more miracles come true. Mr. President, colleagues, with 1/5 of the global population, China's march toward modernization has important far-reaching significance for the world. The path that China pursues is one of peace and development, not plunder and colonialization. It is a path of win-win cooperation, not zero-sum game. and it is one of harmony between man and nature,
我们将
not
继续破解人类
destructive
发展难题，
exploitation of resources.
提供中国智
We will
慧，
continue to
为
contribute
创
our
造人类
input
文明新
to
形态
meeting the
做出
challenges
中国贡
facing
献。
human development and make our
下个
contribution
月，
to
中国
creating
共产
a
党
new
第
form
20
of
次
human
全国代表大
advancement.
会即将在北
Next
京召
month,
开。
the CPC will
这次
convene
大会
its 20th
将秉持
National
全体
Congress.
中国人民的意
This
愿，
Congress will,
科
in
学规
response
划
to
未
the
来5
expectation
年
of
乃
all
至
the
更长
Chinese
时期
people,
国
set
家发展的目标
well-conceived goals
任
and
务，
tasks for China's
全面国
development
化
in the
中
next
国未来
5
发
years
展
and
的
beyond,
宏伟蓝图。
and draw an overarching
站
plan
在新
for
的历史
China's
起点，
future
中国
development.
将以
Having reached
中国
a
式
new
现代化
historical
实现
starting
中华
point,
民族伟大
China
复
will
兴，
follow the Chinese path to
并同
modernization
世界
to
各国
achieve
一
its
道，
national rejuvenation.
为和平发展护
China
航，
will work with other
为团
countries
结
to
进步
safeguard
担当，
peace and development,
携手构建
shoulder the
人
responsibility
类
for
命运共
boosting
同体，
solidarity and
共同
progress,
开创
build a community with a shared
更加
future
美
for
好的世界。
mankind, and embrace an even better
谢谢大
world.
家。
Thank you all.
I thank the State Councillor and Minister for Foreign Affairs of China. I now give the floor to His Excellency Phạm Bình Minh, Deputy Prime Minister of Vietnam.
Mr. President, I join others in congratulating Mr. President on his elections as President of the 77 sections of the General Assembly. Vietnam has full confidence in your able leadership and guidance, and will work with you to steer the work of the Assembly to success. I thank Mr. Abdullah Shahi, President of the 76th section, for his important contributions to the work of the General Assembly, and to Secretary General Antonio Guterres for the leadership and innovation instilled in the organization over the past year. Mr. President, we are at a watershed moment in history. Confrontation, conflicts, and violations of international law continue to intensify, mirroring great power competition and unilateralism. Global military expenditure surged to a record high $2.1 trillion, while the international community failed to mobilize $100 billion for climate actions. The nuclear risk reaches its highest point in decades, but that was still not enough for the NPT Review Conference to achieve any collective commitment to action. The outbreak of armed conflicts and heightened tension, especially between major powers, have made the international security climate more volatile than at any time since the Cold War. The climate crisis and other non-traditional security risks threaten our very existence. The COVID-19 pandemic have wreaked havoc on health systems, economies, and societies worldwide. Poverty, inequalities, violence, and exclusion are denying the rights of millions to the basic necessities of life. With less than a decade to go, the Sustainable Development Goals are even further off track. Facing these multiple crises, developing countries and vulnerable groups who lack the capacity, resources, and resilience to cope with external shocks are those hardest hit. To reverse this course,
we must fundamentally change our ways of thinking and doing things. This entails reshaping a global approach to address global issues, enhancing resilience and placing people at the core of all development efforts. And key to such an approach is international solidarity and partnership at all levels. We know this from our own history. International solidarity has been crucial for the success of Vietnam's national liberations and reunification. Multilateralization and diversification of partnership, meanwhile, have proven indispensable in Vietnam's foreign policies of independence, self-reliance, peace, cooperation, and development. They have opened the door for Vietnam to the world and helped bring catalytic resources to propel Vietnam's đổi mới renovation process. They have helped improve the lives of tens of millions of Vietnamese and brought prosperity to a formerly war-torn country and now confidently on a path to become a developed, high-income country by 2045. But I believe the experience of Vietnam is not an exception. There is abundance of stories about how solidarity and partnership triumph over mistrust and fragmentations and bring about positive change. Mr. President, as we move forward in the spirit of solidarity and partnership, I wish to underline 4 key points. First, a confrontational and zero-sum game approach must be eliminated. Imposition, interventions, and unilateral acts have no place in the good conduct of international affairs. Major powers are particularly looked upon to behave responsibly and work for the common good and not their own selfish interests. Vietnam calls for strengthened multilateralism and international cooperation in the spirit of openness, inclusiveness, equality, and mutual benefit. Major UN and international agendas, especially the 2030 Agenda and climate actions, must not be put on hold due to isolated disagreements among countries. We must stay focused on our common goals and responsibilities. We stand in firm solidarity with the people of Cuba and call for the immediate lifting of the unilateral embargoes against Cuba, contrary to international law. Second, our actions, both individually and collectively, must be guided by and in accordance with international law and the UN Charter. Vietnam firmly believes that respect for international law, especially vis-à-vis the respect for sovereign equality, political independence, and territorial integrity of states. The peaceful settlement of disputes is the most effective and viable measures to prevent conflicts and promote sustainable peace and security. Constructive dialogue and respect for the legitimate rights and interests of all parties, in accordance with international law, are key to resolving differences and reducing tensions. Vietnam calls for the cessation of hostilities in Ukraine and stands ready to contribute to the diplomatic process and the reconstruction and rehabilitation of Ukraine. Third, we need strong and effective multilateral institutions with the UN at the heart to best address global challenges. they are best positioned to initiate and incubate transformative ideas, approaches, and solutions, and to forge partnership and mobilize resources for the implementations of these initiatives. Vietnam welcomes the forward-looking proposals in the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda report. We will engage actively in the deliberations of these proposals and in the preparations of the Summit for the Future and the SDG Summit. We have high hopes for this summit. This summit will provide concrete, meaningful, and long-lasting commitments and actions. Fourth, regional organizations can pioneer and play a prominent role in bolstering multilateral cooperation. In Southeast Asia, ASEAN is doing its part to help address regional and global issues. We are working to build a strong and united ASEAN community and advance the central role of ASEAN in the regional security architecture. Building a broad and extensive network of partnership, ASEAN has created a premier forum for strategic dialogue, engaging important partners of the region, especially with major powers. ASEAN is working hard to implement the 5-point consensus to have 5 comprehensive solutions to the situations in Myanmar. Vietnam underlines the need for maintaining peace, stability, maritime safety, and security in the South China Sea, and call on all parties to resolve disputes by peaceful means with full respect for legal and diplomatic processes. We call on parties to exercise self-restraint, refrain from unilateral activities, and attempts to change the status quo, and not to threaten or to use force in accordance with international law, including the United Nations Charter and UNCLOS 1982. Mr. President, this year, Vietnam celebrates its 45th year as a member of the United Nations. Since that September Day in 1977, the UN has been a trusted friend and reliable partner, standing with us in our most difficult time of post-war reconstruction, and more recently in the fight against COVID-19, and accompanying us on our path of Doi Moi renovation, improving our people's life and advancing the country's development. Welcoming Vietnam to the United Nations 45 years ago, President of the 32nd sections of the General Assembly highlighted Vietnam's dedication to the purposes and principles and affirmed that, and I quote, "The admission of Vietnam marks a further step towards consolidating peace and security in the world." End of quote. 45 years on, and this statement remains valid. Vietnam's history and its vision for the future has always been intimately linked with the aspirations for peace and development. We have consistently supported and pursued a balanced and constructive approach in seeking lasting solutions to global issues. As members of major UN bodies, most recently the Security Council, Vietnam has consistently underlined the importance to uphold the UN Charter and to ensure that the UN best serves the needs and interests of all members. Our men and women are proudly serving in UN peacekeeping missions in South Sudan, Abyei, and Central African Republic. Vietnam is sparing no efforts to realize our commitment to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, an ambitious goal given the level of development and technology capacity of Vietnam. At the Human Rights Council, Vietnam has consistently worked to advance mutual understanding and respect, foster dialogue and cooperation. We lead efforts to promote the rights of vulnerable groups in the context of climate change. And now, we are aspiring a seat at the Human Rights Council for the term 2023 to 2025. I hope we can count on your valuable support, just as you can count on us as a reliable, responsive, and constructive partner in the promotions and protections of human rights for all. Mr. President, in unity there is strength. With solidarity and partnership, there is power. Let us work together in unity, solidarity, and a spirit of partnership to surmount the interlocking challenges we all are facing together. In this watershed moment, for the sake of sustainable peace and development in the world. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister of Vietnam. I now give the floor to His Excellency Salam Sai Komasit, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Laos People's Democratic Republic.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin by extending my sincere congratulations to His Excellency Sabah Ghorrsi on his election as President of the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly, and I wish him a successful presidency of this UNGA session. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Lao People's Democratic Republic in this August Assembly. Mr. President, we are at a critical juncture when the international community is facing multifaceted challenges ranging from armed conflicts to environmental crisis and economic downturn that set back global development. Multilateralism is always at the heart of international cooperation, has been undermined by unilateralism, has been applied widely. These challenges, already exacerbated by COVID-19 pandemic, have hindered and reversed the development gains attained during the past decades. The implementations of the SDG has never before been so tarnished. It is disheartening that the most vulnerable peoples and countries are now suffering the most. Countries in special situations such as LDCs, LLDC, and SEEDs, which have endured the most difficult period coping with COVID-19 impacts, are additionally confronting climate, food, energy crisis. It is more alarming than ever for the international community to find solutions, not only transformative, but also more practical, effective, action-oriented, sustainable, and tailored to the most pressing need, so the most vulnerable are not left behind. Mr. President, 77 years after the United Nations was formed, we shall no longer be here in this august assembly to state any claim, lecture, blame, or shame one another. Our world needs greater attention, concerted effort, and common desire. We, as stipulated in the Charter, are the people of the United Nations. We shall gather here to find the most appropriate solution and take the most urgent action to address the problem we are all facing today. This cannot be done without firmly upholding the principle of the UN Charter and preserving multilateralism. Our United Nations was founded to prevent another catastrophic world war. Our shared wisdom and political will to find the most pragmatic and suitable solution to multiple crises threatening us all today must lie on the top of other individual interests. In doing so, we must strengthen our solidarity, cooperation, and collaboration, and must not create confrontation and division. As such, it is necessary, and after more than 7 decades, that the United Nations revitalizes and increases its ability to effectively address global problems. In this context, the United Nations needs to effectively fulfill its mandate in maintaining international peace and security, as well as promoting development cooperation. It is our common desire that the United Nations be transformed in order to respond to the current global landscape and needs in our joint effort to overcome the unfolding challenges which threaten international peace and development. The international community must find peaceful and lasting resolution to any conflict and disputes around the world, including the Middle East problem. We believe that unilateral sanction or measures cannot be effective, as it is not only contravened to the principle of the Charter of the United Nations and international law, but also hampers the national development of other countries.